The name of the game during the heyday of the Wild West was conflict. Whether it was between the United States and foreign powers, such as Spain or Mexico, settlers and their long list of enemies, or within the settlers' communities themselves, everywhere you looked, someone was at odds with someone else. Not only that, but most folks on the western frontier were apt for protection, looking for every possible safety net when guarding their family or what little possessions they brought with them on their westward journey. As a result, the varying weapons and other protection systems utilized by the pioneers ballooned in the mid-19th century, heightened by the increase in territorial conflict such as the U.S. Civil War and the American Indian Wars. This then coincided with the mass production of firearms, and you're left with a broad list of guns and artillery made available to the cowboys, soldiers, and lawmen of the Old West. To garner a better understanding of what these types of guns were and how they were used, we're breaking down the major groups of arms and protection systems of American pioneers. Thus, here are 5 specific weapons used by cowboys on the western frontier. One of the most storied firearms of the Old West is the Colt Patterson, a revolver and one of the first repeating firearms that utilized multiple chambers, a revolving cylinder, a stationary barrel, and sold on a commercial basis. The idea for the Patterson has debated origins. Some claim that Samuel Colt came up with the revolver after seeing the windlass technology on the vessel Corvo. Others believe Colt had a preview of the flintlock revolver during a tour of the Tower of London in 1830. Regardless, the design was formed and tweaked up until February 25, 1836, when the Colt Patterson was patented in 3 countries, including the United States. Each revolver included 5 shots and could be carried via pockets, belts, or holsters, all depending on the user's preference. The gun could be purchased with calibers ranging from 28 to 36, firing a single action with an effective range of 65 yards, or 59 meters. The Patterson took its name from the factory that was first utilized by Samuel Colt, called the Patton Arms Company in Paterson, New Jersey. The factory was able to produce about 2,800 Patterson revolvers over a 6-year period from 1836 until the plant's closure in 1842. Among the 2,800 revolvers manufactured, there were various sizes and models produced, including the Baby Patterson that made concealment easier for those seeking discretion. The first few models of the Colt Patterson required a disassembly of the gun itself in order to reload the weapon. However, a design overhaul in 1839 saw the addition of a hinged loading level and capping window. This allowed for users to reload on the move and increased the gun's widespread usage. At first, the gun was seen as easily breakable and malfunctioned too often, but was still a staple of the United States Army during Florida's Second Seminole War, due to the increase in firepower for the soldiers. After modifications enhanced the revolver's overall quality, it became one of the favorite firearms of the Texas Rangers. By 1842, the Colt Patterson had arrived en masse to Texas and was utilized by many a ranger in their ongoing conflicts with the Comanche and other warrior bands during the Texas American Indian Wars. The biggest advocate of the Colt Patterson was Captain Jax Hayes of the Texas Rangers, whose successful campaign in the Battle of Bandera Pass was attributed to the flexibility and longevity that the Patterson provided his men in conflict. His fellow captain of the U.S. Mounted Rifles, Samuel Walker, shared his affinity for the Colt Patterson and was dispatched to New York in 1846 on behalf of General Zachary Taylor to improve the Patterson even further for a better experience on the battlefield. The Springfield trapdoor rifles and carbines have a long storied history on the American frontier, dating all the way back to its earliest forms in the Erskine S. Allen's converted muzzleloaders of the Civil War's final conflicts in 1865. These needle guns, starting with the Springfield Model 1866, were originally 58 caliber rimfire rifles with a metallic cartridge, eventually evolving into the second model, the Allen designed Springfield Model 1866, which allowed for larger cartridges such as the 50 caliber 70 centerfire. These breech loaders were supplied to the U.S. Army located on the Bozeman Trail in present-day Wyoming, where the hayfield and wagon box fights occurred in 1867. These trapdoor rifles were also the preferred firearm of Buffalo Bill, whose Springfield 1866, nicknamed Lucrezia Borgia, helped him kill hundreds of bison. The moniker came from the striking yet violent Italian noblewoman of the same name, and the gun helped launch Buffalo Bill's legacy as one of the greatest American big game hunters in history. The Allen trapdoor design continued to be perfected over the next few years, and in 1873, the next great breech-loading rifle was born. The cartridge on the Springfield 1873 was made to handle 45 caliber 405 grain bullets, with 70 grains of black powder needed for propulsion. The muzzle's velocity came in at around 410 meters per second and allowed for a powerful load to match the irregular fighting patterns of the time. Not all usage of the Springfield 1873 was smooth sailing. In some instances, the copper cartridge casing would jam in the breech, as well as welding the case to the breech after firing. It created issues on the battlefield, as fixing these errors required manual extraction. These issues are thought to have been what plagued the soldiers under the command of Colonel George Custer during the Battle of the Little Bighorn. However, archaeological evidence has since disproved this as being a major issue during the conflict. Nevertheless, the Springfield 1873 was still such a powerful and precise weapon. It remained a fixture on the frontier for years, especially after the introduction of brass cartridge cases replaced copper. The rifle was utilized by the U.S. Army in countless battles with southwestern indigenous tribes, such as the Comanche and the Apache tribes. It is sometimes regarded as the firearm that had the biggest impact on the defeat of Native Americans in the last few couple of years in the Texas Indian Wars, and was heavily operated in combat all the way until the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. One of the more iconic handguns in American history comes in the form of the Philadelphia Derringer, a percussion handgun produced from 1852 to 1868 and designed by none other than Henry Derringer himself. The Philadelphia, and Derringers at large, were greatly inspired by the old overcoat pistols used as protection against highwaymen and other small-time criminals. These boot, muff, and pocket pistols could be easily hidden and evolved through flintlocks, cap and ball, and then double-barreled caplock mechanisms. The Philadelphia improved on the concealed carry idea and was so popular amongst users that it was one of the most shared gun designs by competitors in the United States. The original Philadelphia Derringer was operated by firing percussion caps on the handgun to dry the leftover moisture, removing those caps' remains, putting it in a half-cock position, pouring 1 to 2 grams of black powder inside, and ramming the lead ball into the powder without leaving an air pocket. After that, all the user had to do was place a new percussion cap on the nipple of the gun, cock the hammer all the way back, point, and pull the trigger. Later models would come with their springs and mechanisms found behind the hammer to protect it from residue and dirt. With many Philadelphia models coming with front sights only, or no sights at all, this specific Derringer was thought more of a point-and-shoot firearm rather than aim-and-shoot. It was also a common practice for users to fire and reload at least once a day, to keep the handgun in good shape as well as preventing misfires or explosions. At the end of the manufacturing period, at least 15,000 Derringers were sold. Many bought the Philadelphia Derringer as a pair, due to the inconsistent accuracy and wanting a second shot if the first missed its target. However, most Philadelphias that lasted until present day are without their original twin Derringer. The Derringer was popular in the Wild West, mainly for its aforementioned size, perfect for concealment and hidden carry. It was especially desired by undercover outlaws, poker players, and really any citizen of the Western Territories that wanted discreet protection from the inherent lawlessness plaguing smaller settlements. However, the most infamous Derringer came away from the frontier and on the Atlantic side of the United States. It was the preferred firearm of John Wilkes Booth, who used the percussive handgun in his successful assassination of former President Abraham Lincoln, making the Philadelphia one of the most single-handedly impactful weapons in America's storied history. Hailed as the gun that won the West by its very own manufacturer, the Winchester Model 1873 lever-action repeating rifle truly has lived on as one of the more iconic weapons in Old West lore. The Winchester Model 1873 was made from its model year all the way until the onset of the Roaring Twenties in America, with 720,000 guns sold in all. Similar to the aforementioned Springfield trapdoors, the Model 1873 was the celebrated predecessor to the Winchester Model 1866, but featured the company's first ever centerfire option. It first came with the chamber for the 44 caliber 40 grain cartridge, and later upgraded to include the handgun cartridges of 3840 and 3220. This allowed users to carry twice the firearms to just the one ammunition. With the popularity increase amongst both Outlaws and Lawmen alike, other manufacturers, such as Remington or Smith & Wesson, matched the upgrades with revolvers of their own that could also chamber the Winchester's calibers. With the Model 1873, one could purchase either the 24-inch rifle, the 20-inch carbine, or the musket. However, the standard barrel rifle was by far the most popular. Musket was a term simply used for the full-length military-grade option, and this edition only made up of about 5% of all sales in the 19th century. It was also common at the time for Winchester to customize their rifles according to the wishes of the buyer, and these requests ranged from all sorts of new details. Cowboys and horsemen were especially fond of Model 1873, as the internal toggle and link action made them easier to operate and maintain while either in combat or simply on the move. They were also perfect fits on a saddle scabbard, allowing for easy transport and a quick arm. By 1874, the Winchester Model 1873 was the preferred rifle for many Texas Rangers, due to the number of caliber options they had, in addition to the hassle-free nature of the gun. Later on, the Deputy U.S. Marshals at Fort Smith, Arkansas, made the Model 1873 a force to be reckoned with, as they played an integral part in Ned Christie's war, the hunt for the infamous Cherokee outlaw. Other notable figures to champion the 73 Winchester are Lawman Pat Garrett, his prized casualty and legendary outlaw himself, Billy the Kid, as well as the iconic criminals of Butch Cassidy and Belle Starr. One of the most iconic guns of both the American Civil War and the Wild West period in U.S. history was the Colt Army Model 1860, a 44 caliber cap and ball single-action revolver designed by the one and only Samuel Colt. The Army 1860 was developed using the specifications of the 1851 Navy revolver, a 36 cap and ball handgun that featured a frame that matched the size of the Colt's newest classic. Their biggest differences came in the form of the Army 1860's forcing cones and creeping loading levers. Model 1860 was manufactured for 13 years, a time period that saw over 200,000 of the guns sold, with nearly half of them purchased by the United States military. The U.S. was drawn to the revolver's accuracy from between 75 and 100 yards, due to the fixed front sight and rear sights attached in the notch of the hammer. The Army 1860 featured a rotating cylinder of 6 shots as opposed to 5, and required the 44-inch diameter lead to be propelled by a 30-grain charge. The percussion cap that ignited the shot was made of copper and included a charge of mercury fulminate. Model 1860s fired with an average velocity of 600 to 900 feet per second, but could reach 1,000 feet per second if more powder was loaded before firing. Another allure to the Colt Army model was its lightweight and slim build, all thanks to the fixed cylinder pin and strong lower frame, allowing for the gun to be assembled without a top strap or really anything at all above the cylinder. Of course, This meant that the barrel had to be removed in order to remove the cylinder, but it wasn't that big of a deal if the gun was functioning properly on the battlefield. The battlefield is definitely where the Colt 1860 made its stake to fame. They were the first guns sent to dealers below the Mason-Dixon line, before the United States Navy purchased about 1,000 units for their Atlantic and Gulf barricades. In May of 1861, the Army factions began to put in their own orders, and by February of 1864, over 127,000 Model 1860s were found across Civil War embattlements, mostly on the side of the Union, but some could be found in Confederate camps as well. The soldiers on both sides of the war loved how easy it was to holster an 1860 on their hip, in addition to the excess stopping power that outperformed the old Colt Dragoons, a popular firearm among citizen holders, but lacked the luster newer arms provided on the battlefield. As the Colt 1860 swept through the cavalries and infantries of the Civil War, the revolver was also making its way out west. The Texas Rangers, like many of the top-notch firearms of the era, were proponents of the lightweight single action. It wasn't just U.S. lawmen who fancied the Army Model 1860, however. The legendary Mormon mountain man and personal bodyguard of Brigham Young, Porter Rockwell, was known to have carried one by his side, as were the James brothers of the James Younger gang, including notorious outlaw Jesse James himself. The Texan outlaw and train robber Sam Bass also famously carried a Colt 1860 on occasion, both in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory and the arid deserts of central Texas. For all intents and purposes, it was a defining weapon of the American frontier, just not the only one in the holsters and armories held by the legends of yesteryear. The dangers of the Wild West were certainly never too few and far between. Whether it was the constant threat of bandits or outlaws peering around every corner, constant conflicts between rival homesteaders and Native Americans, or the general sense of lawlessness that permeated the western frontier, safety and security were rare guarantees in a land plagued by troubles at every turn. These dangers didn't all come in the form of human boogeymen and endless infighting, however. Sometimes they came from the untamed wilderness, Mother Nature's unpredictability, and famine for the most unfortunate. They also came in the form of various diseases. Sickness ran rampant all across the early days of America's history, especially as Europeans settled across the country and brought with them plagues and pandemics that the Native Americans held no immunity towards. To make better sense of the calamity that sickness brought forth across the frontier, here are common diseases and illnesses seen in the Wild West. Without a doubt, the most destructive of all the diseases to strike the western frontier was cholera. Cholera is a bacterial infection of the small intestines, spread through unclean water and food contaminated by human feces. The illness sometimes presents little to no symptoms, but often is characterized by intense diarrhea over a few days, as well as severe muscle cramps and vomiting. With the diarrhea often comes an electrolyte imbalance that leads to physical deformities such as wrinkled hands, wrinkled feet, cold, tough skin, and red, sunken eyes. Cholera has been such a destructive force throughout history that it's actually spawned 7 different pandemics, including one that has been ongoing since 1961, according to the World Health Organization. The most critical cholera outbreak as it's related to the Wild West was the third cholera pandemic, which lasted from 1846 to 1860 and killed tens of thousands of people, most notably in Great Britain and along the California, Oregon, and Mormon trails of the western frontier. These numbers range anywhere from 6,000 to 12,000 fatalities, just on these 3 trails alone, not to mention the various other trails and settlements dotting the plains, mountains, and deserts that disappeared from disease as quickly as they were constructed. When considering the atmosphere of the westward trails and the poor quality of life in general in the Old West, it makes sense that cholera decimated so many lives in the 19th century. The trails offered very little opportunities by way of sanitation, whether it be folks bathing or cleaning their clothes. These activities usually occurred near unsafe drinking water that was consumed anyway, simply because dehydrated settlers had no other choice. Once the drinking water was contaminated, it would be tough sledding for the entire party. Folks with cholera became extremely dehydrated, and most likely continued to drink the bad water out of total desperation. It was for all intents and purposes a cycle of pain and death. And while not everyone who contracted cholera died, medicine was not even close to the point of being able to detect the bacteria early and keep folks hydrated while they toiled away, stranded in the wilderness. Due to the lack of medical care and proper electrolyte restoration, many who contracted the worst of the bacteria would die within 24 hours of the initial stomachache. While some doctors attempted to prescribe laudanum and camphor, nothing could cure cholera, only ease the crippling pain. Camphor was an oil derived from an Asian species of tree, while laudanum was an incredibly bitter tincture made from opium. This meant that if those taking the drug for cholera survived the disease, they'd most likely be left addicted to opium as a result. It was horrifying no matter how you looked at it. Cholera first appeared in American recorded history in 1832, traveling all the way to Missouri and Louisiana via riverboats along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. It then broke westward during the 1849 California gold rush, before peaking in 1850 as large caravans of settlers made their way towards dreams of fame and fortune. Of course, pioneers weren't the only casualties of the disease, as cholera swept through Native American communities that shared contaminated water sources along those same trails. In fact, cholera was so bad in certain areas, 2/3 of the Southern Cheyenne tribes were wiped out from the disease, as well as half of the Pawnee tribes. Native American healers and medicine men were just as taken aback as their white counterparts, with nothing in their back pocket to relieve so many folks suffering from what would later be called the Unseen Destroyer. In a similar vein to cholera was dysentery, a disease not unknown to most civilizations around the world by the time westward migration began in America. Also known as bloody flux in various cultures, dysentery is a horribly uncomfortable sickness featuring fever and bloody diarrhea, which led to dehydration and the same slow death put on by cholera. There are two common causes of dysentery. One is a bacteria, and the other is a parasitic amoeba. Both of them infect the intestines and cause severe inflammation. Both are introduced to the human body the same way cholera spreads, through contaminated water and locations involving poor sanitation. One common sight seen along the Oregon Trail, and others like it, were deep holes dug along the banks of rivers, streams, and elongated marshes dotting the western landscape. These holes were used as watering holes and drinking wells for caravans on the go. They were also utilized by homesteaders in the short term, while wells were constructed and plumbing was but a distant dream. These shared water sources were then quickly infested with germs and bacteria, a ripe recipe for spreading disease. To treat dysentery, medics often prescribed castor oil, a vegetable oil derived from pressed castor beans. Of course, modern interpretations of castor oil clarify it as a laxative itself. However, back in the 19th century, it was thought to increase the appetite of those who were sick so that they might eat, stay hydrated, and avoid the pitfalls of electrolyte imbalance. Rounding out the gastrointestinal horrors of the Wild West is diphtheria, the technical term for throat distempers from around the world, dating back to at least the 16th century. Diphtheria is more commonly thought of as a childhood disease, with the bulk of cases coming in babies and children. However, it was also contracted by plenty of adults along the western frontier. The illness is an infection of a common bacterium, and while most cases are asymptomatic, it can still be spread regardless of symptoms. The bacterium travels from host to host by direct physical contact, but it is also an airborne disease that can stick on inanimate objects as well. Symptoms usually appeared 2 to 5 days after the initial exposure, and presented themselves through fever, followed by a sore throat featuring gray or white splotches covering the tonsils and the back of the throat. If these discolored patches grew to any significant size, the passage of air was partially or completely blocked, and even something as simple as breathing became increasingly difficult for the infected person. Lymph nodes have also been known to swell greatly in diphtheria cases, forming what is known as bull neck in infants and young children. There's also a second type of diphtheria that impacts the skin, eyes, and genitals. This comes in the form of lesions and blisters, which are sometimes so intense they form open wounds that leave the infected prone to other infections and other diseases. Diphtheria also came with swaths of other various complications that were especially difficult to treat while moving cross-country or hunkered down in a poor settlement. These included nerve inflammation, kidney failure, bleeding issues, abnormal heart rates, and sometimes even paralysis. With this in mind, it's easy to understand why diphtheria was so dangerous for both the very young and the very old. The mortality rate sat at around 5 to 10%, and there were no useful treatments at the time of westward migration. For this reason alone, diphtheria was considered the biggest child killer in all the Wild West, as simple rest and an increase in fluids wasn't enough to stave off the disease for the better part of a century. One of the most frequent diseases you'd hear about in textbooks about the Old West is a generic illness known as mountain fever. Mountain fever is actually the combination of a few different fevers and sicknesses, most often grouped together with Colorado tick fever, typhoid fever, and scarlet fever. Colorado tick fever is exactly what it sounds like, a virus brought on by the bite of an infected Rocky Mountain wood tick. While this specific illness differs from the Rocky Mountain spotted fever, their symptoms include much overlap. The fever was often contracted in the rural mountains of the Colorado Territory, bleeding up into Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, and Oregon, as the trails saw the brunt of the disease early on. Infected parties usually felt symptoms creep up anywhere from 3 days to 3 weeks after the initial bite. The biggest issue with Colorado tick fever is the double onset of symptoms. One battle with the fever would linger for 3 days, then it would disappear before coming back with a vengeance. Those with the disease were warned not to get too relaxed in the eye of the hurricane, as was said in regards to the calm between storms. The most frequent issues with Colorado tick fever ranged from the obvious fever and chills to pounding headaches and light sensitivity. Folks would also suffer from muscle pain, vomiting, and rashes. These symptoms would then intensify during the second round of the infection. While death wasn't common with Colorado tick fever, its complicated nature drove infected parties mad. The virus could live in the bloodstream for almost half a year, making blood transfusions incredibly risky in the Rocky Mountain region, both back in the day and in modern times. There was, and still is, no proper treatment plan for Colorado tick fever, which meant many a sick miner in the mountainsides during Pikes Peak Gold Rush and beyond. Typhoid fever was a similar beast, transmitted by a bacteria called typhi that appeared much like the Salmonella bacteria still commonly seen in contaminated food and water today. Typhoid fever rained hellfire on its unlucky victims, bringing symptoms forth as soon as 6 days after exposure. With it came weakness, headaches, stomach pain, and a spotty rose-colored rash. Many folks who encountered typhoid fever were unable to receive relevant treatment, and their symptoms would last for weeks on end. This could lead to mental confusion and loss of appetite, leading to cholera-like malnutrition. Worst of all was the highly contagious nature of the fever, which fed into the 20% mortality rate seen in the Old West, especially during the summer months. One of the popular myths spread amongst pioneers in the heyday of typhoid fever was that consuming lettuce could increase one's chances at survival if they contracted the bacteria. Of course, this did little to nothing in regards to treating the disease, and would sometimes increase infection rates if the lettuce came unclean and contaminated itself. The last of the 3 mountain fevers was scarlet fever, a disease caused by the infection of the group A strep bacteria, the same bacteria that causes strep throat in the present day. Scarlet fever differs in that the bacteria releases a toxin that causes a deep red rash to appear on the tongue and body. Other symptoms include sore throat, swollen lymph nodes, and a headache that doesn't seem to shake. There obviously was no vaccine back in the heart of the Wild West, nor is there one available in modern times. Thus, Many of those who suffered from scarlet fever saw a lifetime of complications follow them. This meant kidney disease, heart disease, and arthritis, all plagued the fever's survivors well into their middle-aged years. That is, if they lived long enough to begin with. To treat scarlet fever, doctors on the frontier would prescribe strict bed rest, and usually a non-solid diet that consisted of liquid whey, rice water, or broth. While medicines couldn't cure the disease, the infected would be given Epsom salts, ammonia, or nitrate silver in attempts to stop the poison from working within the body. Some folks would go as far as to shave their head when battling the fever, to stay cool and allow for cool compresses to ward off the fever at its peak. With the introduction of penicillin and other antibiotics, the treatment for scarlet fever in developed countries is not anything what it used to be, but the same could be said for most of the diseases that ran rampant in the Old West. If anything, they gave reason to the age-old adage that the most deadly things in the world are the things you cannot see, making the western frontier a breeding ground for sickness and dangers like the stories of yesteryear told. One of the more iconic images originating from the Wild West period of the United States history is that of the wagon trains crawling across open plains, dry deserts, and rugged mountainsides. Wagon trains were important parts to the European exploration of America, specifically the real-world implementation of Manifest Destiny and the desire of settlers to move westward, itching to see what had mostly been unexplored by previous European conquests. Of course, the settlers and their wagon trains weren't the only human caravans operating across the American West. Surrounding the wagons in all corners of all trails connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific were indigenous tribes who had called the American frontier their home for millennia. To the tribes, the wagon trains were deliberate encroachments on their land, often against the wishes of opposing indigenous communities. Even with treaties in place between the indigenous and the colonists, bands of Native Americans did not approve of the excess migration and felt the settlers were either disrespectful to their homeland or outright violent. Thus, violence was a regular mark laid upon wagon trains and their misadventures along various trails in the West. Trains were raided and numerous folks were slain, as conflicts between the indigenous and who they believed were invaders truly boiled over into the mid-19th century. Here's the story of 3 wagon train raids and massacres that reflect the inherent violence of the Wild West and the disconnect between white settlers and Native Americans during the height of Manifest Destiny. In May of 1871, a contractor by the name of Henry Warren was dispatched by the United States government to deliver foodstuffs and other supplies to various military forts across the western vistas of Texas. These forts included Fort Richardson, Fort Griffin, and Fort Concho. Warren and his team of 12 freighters traveled via the Jacksboro-Belknap Road, a direct route landing them at each destination in the shortest and safest amount of time. They departed with 10 mule-led wagons filled to the brim with corn and fodder feed for the livestock. At the same time, about 150 indigenous warriors of a Kiowa tribe and a few from a Comanche tribe were descending south from the Fort Sill Reservation in present-day Oklahoma. The band of warriors were led by famous orator and war chief Satanta, medicine man and experienced fighter Satank, and noted chief Adoit, all of the Kiowa tribe. They were looking to secure safety across the Red River of Texas and return to another reservation. However, they also saw the opportunity to strike back against the U.S. government for the encroachment during the long-gestating Texas-American Indian Wars. Thus, in the same May of 1871, the band of Kiowa and Comanche camouflaged themselves within the brush and watched as General William T. Sherman of the U.S. Army lead an inspection force of 18 men throughout West Texas. They don't attack the retinue at this point, though, as a shaman by the name of Momanti had predicted the night before that a large crew with more supplies to raid would become available soon after. The shaman's prophecy came true when on May 18, 1871, Henry Warren's wagon train ran into General Sherman's crew along the Jacksboro-Belknap Road. Not even 60 minutes later, just before Salt Creek Crossing, Satanta and his 150 warriors surprised the Warren party and plundered their supplies. During the raid, 3 Kiowa warriors were killed and 7 of Warren's 12 men were slain, and all of the supplies and livestock were taken from the wagon train. The 5 teamsters who did manage to escape were led by Thomas Brazil, and were able to venture all 20 miles to Fort Richardson on foot. There, they reunited with General Sherman, who learned of the Warren wagon train raid and sent Colonel Ranald S. Mackenzie to arrest the Kiowa war chiefs. Back at Salt Creek Crossing, instead of crossing the Red River, Setanta and company reverted back to Fort Sills to claim additional rations. And instead of going in quietly, however, they discussed the raid with an indigenous government agent named Laurie Tatum. Tatum then alerted General Sherman of the warrior band's arrival, and the three chiefs, Setanta, Setank, and Adawit, were all arrested. They were sent to Fort Richardson to stand trial, but only 2 of the 3 Kiowa warriors made it alive, as Setank was killed after attempting to flee the U.S. Army transportation train. Initially, Setanta and Adawit were sentenced to death, but eventually these sentences were reduced to life in prison by the then Texas Governor Edmund Davis. It was only an additional 2 years before the war chiefs were released from prison after Kiowa Principal Chief Guipago successfully negotiated on their behalf. In the end, Setanta returned to the battlefield to fight for his tribe's sovereignty and to retaliate against the elimination of the American buffalo. Adawit took a quieter approach when returning home, but both men ended up back in prison before the end of the 1870s. In the summer of 1864, 2 families residing in eastern Kansas, called the Kelly and Larimer families, packed up most of what they owned in 4 wagons after deciding to pursue their dreams of a new life out west. The Kelly party consisted of husband and wife Josiah and Fanny Kelly, their 7-year-old adopted daughter Mary, a couple of hired assistants and father and son duo Andy and Franklin Sullivan, 2 African-American men who had recently been freed as slaves by a small band of Cherokee Native Americans, and a single straggler by the name of Gardner Wakefield. Along with the Kelly party came the Larimer party, including husband and wife William and Sarah Larimer, their 8-year-old son Frank, and their specially hired wagon driver Noah Daniel Taylor. The Kelly family had long gestated plans to open up a general store, or maybe a hotel, for a couple of mining companies starting up in the Montana Territory in 2 cities called Virginia City and Bannock. Thus, their wagons were chock full of 1.5 tons of flour, a half ton of coffee, a half ton of dried fruit, 45 gallons of liquor, and other various dried goods and clothing. In addition, the Kellys brought with them 25 calves and 50 dairy cows to complete their future dairy ranch. The Larimer family had different aspirations. Sarah was a somewhat successful commercial photographer in her own right, and had acquired a bevy of photographic equipment, including cameras and lighting tech available at the time. The Larimers had plans to open up a photography studio at the same mining camps, in an effort to capture the endeavors of folks starting new lives across the western frontier. To kick off their joint ventures, the Kelly-Larimer party set out on the Oregon Trail. Not long after, they met up with a single wagon train driven by the nearly blind Reverend Andrew Sharp, an old Methodist pastor who looked to bring his Christian teachings to the Old West. Reverend Sharp felt endeared by the 2 families and joined them on their journey. After entering what is present-day Wyoming, the Kelly-Larimer party turned north along the Oregon Trail that broke off through southern Wyoming territory. It was around this time, when the train moved about 120 miles northwest of Fort Laramie, Wyoming, that trouble started brewing across the horizon. At this time, there had been little communication between the United States government and the existing indigenous tribes calling the Wyoming Territory their home for generations. The indigenous people were incensed that white settlers had started using their routes for homesteading, and without a binding treaty or lawful understanding, it left the smaller wagon trains prone to conflict. In July of 1864, a band of Oglala Native Americans, a subset of the Lakota tribes, heard of white pioneers cascading across what they referred to as the Holy Road, and wanted to get a better look for themselves. At first, the meeting was decided to be one of peace and fellowship. The Sioux and all of their tribes believed in the fostering of kinship with all living things, and simply wanted to eat and smoke with the white travelers. Thus, in that same July, the band of Oglala encountered the Kelly-Larimer party at their campsite near Little Box Elder Creek. There, they were joined by a few other bands of other Sioux tribes, and their numbers are said to have ranged from 80 to 100, but still they arrived in peace. The Kelly-Larimer party happily obliged, providing their indigenous acquaintances with sugar, bread, and most importantly, tobacco. When the tribesmen left only to return a second time with continued friendly relations, the wagon train cooked supper for all 100-plus people. Up until this point, the positive connections between the indigenous peoples and the Kelly-Larimer party were well documented. The Larimers' wagon driver, Noah Taylor, had actually written home only a week prior, stating that they felt no threat or violence was imminent from the surrounding tribes. Unfortunately, the pleasantries ended later that night of the feast. After the Oglala tribesmen left the Little Box Elder Creek camp, a Sioux messenger intercepted the band and informed them of an indigenous massacre along the Missouri River, where U.S. soldiers had beheaded some of the Oglala's relatives and placed their skulls at the ends of poles. The warrior members of the tribe were fueled with rage and voted to declare vengeance on their slain brothers and sisters. Back at the wagon train camp, the Kelly and Larimer families were unaware of the happenings at the Missouri River and continued gathering wood for their fires and preparing for next day's meals. That is until they were beset with an array of gunfire and arrowheads. Much to their surprise, the Oglala had returned with revenge, swiftly killing Franklin Sullivan, Reverend Sharp, and Noah Taylor before they could escape. The rest of the wagon train parties fled as quickly as they could. Josiah Kelly camouflaged himself in some nearby brush and evaded capture whilst the rest of his family turned around in the other direction. Up ahead, another wagon appeared over the hill after following the Kelly-Larimer party only behind a day's time. Their scout leader and outrider was also killed by the Oglala tribesmen, and the wayfaring wagon turned around as quickly as it had arrived. Back at the campsite, the Oglala raided what was left of the wagons. They emptied the sacks of flour across the ground and packed as much food as they could on their horses. The rest of the belongings were trampled or burned, and 4 members of the party were ultimately captured, including Fanny Kelly, her daughter Mary, Sarah Larimer, and her son Frank. The most unsettling aspect of the raid was the fate of little Mary Kelly. She escaped capture with her mother, Fanny, but was separated after Fanny was kidnapped once more by the Oglala warriors. For a few days, Mary wandered along the creek bed. There was a point where 3 U.S. soldiers spotted her through the bush, but figured she was being used as bait for an ambush. They decided to encircle her position over the course of a night, but by dawn had lost all traces of the young girl. Unfortunately, the next day, her body was found scalped and pierced with arrows by a separate group of settlers making their way through Powder River country. Elsewhere, Sarah and her son Frank managed to flee from captivity after only 2 days. They were aided by a peaceful Oglala tribesman who had felt the pair were being held unfairly. They were able to make it as far as the trading post in Deer Creek and were reunited with William. Fanny Kelly, however, wasn't as fortunate. She remained with the band of Oglala tribesmen that initially kidnapped her for 5 months, unable to be rescued by her surviving husband, Josiah. Josiah had dispatched a separate group of Native Americans to find her, but they never could pinpoint her exact location. Fanny was eventually freed in the winter of 1865, when a band of Blackfoot Sioux were looking to establish their own peace talks with the Oglala band in Wyoming Territory. The U.S. Army took Fanny back into their custody at Fort Sully along the Missouri River, after Sitting Bull realized the continuance of her captivity could spark greater conflict. In February 1895, Fanny was reunited with Josiah Kelly, and the two opened up a hotel in Ellsworth, Kansas before Josiah died of disease 2.5 years later in July of 1867. Kelly was 8 months pregnant at the time and needed a stable income. Thus, she moved to Sherman Station along the Union Pacific Railroad in Wyoming, where Sarah Larimer was operating her photography studio. Together, the woman decided to write about their trials and tribulations whilst under detainment of the Oglala. Unfortunately, their relationship was frayed after Sarah stole Fanny's personal manuscript and published it under her own name, resulting in a court case and private settlement. Nevertheless, their maligned attempt to migrate westward and join the miners of Montana Territory was never forgotten and is now a vital story within Wyoming lore. The origins of the Utter Party Massacre, also called the Van Ornum Party Massacre or Myers Massacre, began in the southern region of Wisconsin in May of 1860. It was around this time the Van Ornum Party set out for Oregon Territory, specifically the Willamette Valley in the northwest region of the country. About a month later, on June 5, 1860, the Van Ornum Party connected with the Utter Party in Omaha, Nebraska. Together, the parties featured 18 men, 5 women, over 20 children, 12 entire wagons, and enough livestock to reach triple-digit numbers. Targeting a rendezvous in Oregon, it only made sense for the newly formed Utter Van Ornum party to head west together on the Oregon Trail. They made it as far as Fort Hall, Idaho, without as much as a hint of trouble, taking shelter in the mostly abandoned former military base. On August 21st, after a 2.5-month journey, the party of 34 quickly became a party of 40, after a deserter from the army and 5 other discharged vets teamed up with the two factions. They camped for a couple of days to chart the rest of their journey and left camp on August 29th. Before leaving Fort Hall, the party acquired the protective services of a small company of Army soldiers. The security detail numbered 22 men, but after 6 days, the leader of the Dragoons grew tired with some of the Utter Van Ornum party members and ventured back to Fort Hills from Twin Falls, Idaho. Nevertheless, the wagon train pushed forward, and on September 8th, they made it to Castle Creek, Idaho, only a few kilometers from the Oregon border. At this point, another 4 stragglers attached themselves to the wagon train. However, the caravan had lost at least 4 wagons as they rolled into Castle Creek with 8. The losses didn't stop there either. Later that night, after the train members went to sleep, a small band of Native Americans snuck up on the parties and stole a few animals in the livestock brigade. When the Utters and Van Ornums woke up, they immediately knew someone had stolen their animals, but had no choice but to press on. That same day, the wagon train was surrounded by an indigenous band who tried to stampede the livestock. The Utter Van Ornum party quickly formed the now iconic defensive circle around their cattle and actually engaged in peaceful trade talks with the indigenous counterparts. With a few minutes of bartering, the wagon train was left unharmed after trading away food items and other odds and ends for peace, and the Utter Van Ornum party continued traveling northwest. Unfortunately, they didn't make it far. After just 1 more mile of excursion, another band of Native Americans, either from the Shoshone or Bannock tribes, attacked the wagon train, killing Lewis Lawson of the Van Ornum party and 2 of the Army veterans, named William Utley and Charles Kisnell. Still undeterred, however, the parties kept on. On September 10th, another attack was mounted on the wagon train, and Judson Cressy of the Van Ornums was slain. This time, the rest of the parties knew that they had to change their game plan, and moved forward only after leaving behind the rest of their livestock and 4 of the wagons to distract the Native Americans. While it brought the wagon train a sliver of time, the distraction did little to mitigate the attacks. Another round of defense by the indigenous tribes saw another colonist by the name of John Myers die, as well as Elijah Utter when the rest of the surviving party members fled on foot. Abigail Utter, Elijah's wife, refused to leave her husband's side, as did their 4 children, and their family of 6 never made it across the Idaho-Oregon border. In an attempt to gain control of the chaos, 2 brothers of the wagon train survivors, Jacob and Joseph Reith, fled the scene with the remaining soldiers, named Private Theodore Murdoch, Private Henry Snyder, and Sergeant Charles Schamberg. They were joined by the deserter, Charles Chaffee, and all of the men escaped with plenty of weapons, ammunition, and their horses. It wasn't long before they suffered losses too, though, as Teddy Murdoch and Charles Schamberg were killed by the land's defenders. Meanwhile, the rest of the caravan, consisting of 27 colonists, used the nearby Snake River to camouflage themselves. With only a bit of food rations and a few weapons left from the abandoned wagon, their outlook turned sour rather quickly. Eventually, the 27 party members came to an agreement that rather than remain sitting ducks, they would attempt to march forward on foot. As they left, they saw the remains of the wagon train burning in the distance, and they decided not to look back. Of course, it was nearly impossible with the anxiety of another ambush lurking around every corner. To evade capture, the party would sleep in the shrubs during the day and then walk at night until the Native Americans stopped following them. By September 17, 1860, 2 of the members named Goodsell Munson and Christopher Trimble left to seek help, while the remaining 25 found a dying cow and ate it out of desperation. Another 5 days later, and on September 22nd, Munson and Trimble caught up with the surviving Army veterans and the deserter. The men decided it was best to kill one of their horses for food, and Trimble was tasked with bringing it back to the Utter Van Ornum party. By the time Trimble made it back to the original caravan, however, the remaining colonists were engaged with trade talks with a band of Shoshone tribal members. While it seemed peaceful at first, the indigenous did not trust the white settlers with their guns and forcefully removed them.
Thinking quickly on his feet, Trimble decided he would leave with the Shoshone in an attempt to secure more food for his family and the others. He offered himself as a hostage, but was never heard from again, and his remains were recovered about a month later on October 24th. Between them, the rest of the party members slowly died off from numerous causes. Some of the survivors had split off to find a rescue party, but they were eventually killed by scalping, lethal arrow shots, and slit throats by the indigenous tribes. At the same time, 3 of the Van Ornum daughters were taken captive, as well as their brother Reuben. The girls were found starved to death the next year in 1861, but Reuben Van Ornum was found alive. In November of 1862, the Shoshone told Reuben's rescuers of the California Army Volunteer Brigade that the boy was in fact not Reuben, but rather the son of another chief's sister-in-law, but the California Army Volunteer Brigade didn't buy it. While his identity was never confirmed, Reuben ended up leaving his uncle's house in Oregon 8 years later in 1870, due to being unable to return to pioneer life, and he decided to be adopted back into the Shoshone tribe that had originally captured him. Jacob and Joseph Reith were able to make it to the Umatilla Agency in Oregon, and directed a search and rescue faction down to the Burnt River, where the surviving Army vet Munson and the deserter Chafee were inches away from death due to extreme hunger. The remaining survivors, who were neither dead nor captured, set up a camp along the Owyhee River and saw 4 people die in the span of a week from starvation. The others didn't want to meet the same fate and had to resort to cannibalism to survive, eventually eating the deceased children. In the end, 10 people were found alive at the starvation camp, rescued after 45 days spent without resources. They were discovered on October 24, 1860, by Captain Frederick T. Dent of Fort Walla Walla's Army Relief Expedition Forces. The Utter Van Ornum Party Massacre was the deadliest wagon train raid in the history of the Oregon Trail and Washington territories, and a symbol of the consequences settlers encountered in their search for manifest destiny.
The history of food in the United States is one of the more complex histories in the entire world, with Earth's melting pot bringing together countless cultures and lifestyles to allow for any kind of cuisine you can think of, if only a few miles away. However, what would you say if we told you America hasn't always been home to any and every meal you could think of? In fact, go back more than a few decades, and you probably wouldn't be able to recognize the food scene as it stands today. Needless to say, the culture of food, no matter what country or continent you hail from, has changed over the years, whether it's the way we eat, prepare, store, or source each of our meals. While the mass production of both farming and artificial processed foods has changed the way we eat, fast food, chain restaurants, and convenient dining hasn't always been possible, especially prior to the 20th century. Despite the differences in appearance, however, it doesn't remove the beauty and context hiding within every dish available to us throughout history. To learn more about the wonderful food seen across tables and campsites aplenty in 19th century America, here are types of popular foods from the Wild West. Our first meal actually goes well beyond the days of manifest destiny in the 1800s and into the earliest recordings of indigenous tribes flocking the Great Plains of America. Pemmican is a combination of rendered fat and dried meat, occasionally mixed with dried berries. It's served either raw or with a prepared meal, and it was often used as an energy-enriching cuisine and staple to any gathering or shared eating space. Pemmican was invented by the indigenous Plains tribes in North America. However, the exact time it was introduced, or officially invented, is up to debate by scholars. Most pemmican recipes involve the meat used from bison, moose, deer, and elk varieties. However, this specific dish will be centered on from the perspective of Native American buffalo hunters. First, those tasked with killing the bison had a plethora of ways to actually corner and kill the animal. These tactics ranged from chasing American buffalo into snowbanks where their short legs couldn't handle the terrain, or into dead-end canyons where they were trapped at point-blank range. Some tribes would chase herds of buffalo over cliffs, while others would wait for them to cross rivers or bathe in lakes where a retreat was harder to come by. Communal bison hunts, referred to as buffalo jumps, used an assembly line-like approach to butchering the bison. They would first remove the hide before removing the stomach contents. This process had to happen fast, so that the meat wouldn't spoil, but also to cool off the rest of the carcass so that very little meat or resources would be left behind. The first organs to go from the bison were its tongue and then various internal organs. They wouldn't be wasted, however, rather transported to camp where they'd be turned into delicacies. With the bones, members of the buffalo jump would take them and smash the bigger pieces with homemade hammers, pulling out the marrow from within. Bone marrow was both of a preferred taste and incredibly nutritious. It's what kept the butchers going on in such an elongated process. From there, the main section of the body was sliced into 11 different pieces, more for the benefit of those responsible for transporting the meat back to camp. American buffalo meat is exactly like most other meats used for butchering. It's made up of 70 to 75% water, and thus needed to be cut and dried to make for a lighter load. To dry, the sliced meat would first lay flat underneath the sun before being hung over wooden beams above a fire and smoke. This would also add a layer of preservation. Preservation was the name of the game when it came to pemmican, which was heavily used in the long-term storage of foodstuffs for plains tribes. After the slabs of meat were properly dried, they were ready for mixture. First, the preparer would smash the meat into a refined, powder-like substance using a stone hammer or other sturdy, blunt force object. Buffalo fat, or really any form of tallow, would then be added to the crushed meat, mixing the two until fully incorporated. Bone grease was also an instrumental ingredient in some pemmican rituals. Finally, some tribes prepared their pemmican with the aforementioned wild berries picked from the nearby locales. Northern Plains loved making pemmican with dried chokecherries and Saskatoon. Other tribes would stick to the more traditional foraged fruits, such as cranberries or blueberries. However, certain cultures refrained from making pemmican with berries or other sweets outside of ceremonies, such as weddings. It was also common to find pemmican mashed with wild bergamot or dried mint. After completing the preparation phase, the final pemmican mixture would be stored in large bags formed from buffalo hide. They were big enough to hold up to over 100 pounds of bison pemmican. However, this was only seen after the horse trade swept through North America. Bags were much smaller and lighter when left up to pure human transportation. Pemmican was introduced to the rest of the world mainly through the Canadian fur trade, after brief recordings of such compacted bison meat meals existed in the writings of James Isham and Francisco Vázquez de Coronado. The peak of the fur trade in the 19th century saw voyagers traversing the northern plains in short spurts, usually during the spring and summer months when the ice melted from rivers and the waters were free to roam. Due to the time crunch, the fur traders turned to food storage and transportation during their voyages. They learned of pemmican from the local plains tribes, and to avoid having to live off the land during the quick warm seasons, they would carry enough preserves to last them through the entire journey. Bison would first be hunted in the southern plains, mixed into pemmican, and then brought back north to trade with the voyagers and other American or Canadian settlers. Pemmican became such a staple of life in the fur trade colonies, an entire war broke out in 1814 between the Hudson Bay Colony and Northwest Company after then-Governor Miles MacDonell stopped all pemmican exports from the recently formed Red River Colony. It supplied Alexander Mackenzie with food and energy during his Trans-America trek from the Atlantic to the Pacific, as well as the North Pole adventurer Robert Peary during all three of his dog-led expeditions. In fact, even the dogs survived eating Peary's excess pemmican rations. Eventually, pemmican reached far sides of the world and was heavily utilized during wartime, such as by the British troops during the Second Boer War and by the French in the Morocco conflicts of the 1920s. Presently, pemmican is most often seen throughout indigenous communities both in America and Canada, eaten as a delicacy, a regular meal, and for ceremonial purposes, just like it was prepared during its heyday in the 19th century Great Plains. Flipping from a Native American-based food to a pioneer-based food, the next type of Wild West cuisine is hartac, also known as sea biscuits or cabin bread. Hartac was much like pemmican in that it's perfect for long-haul travels and long-term storage,
But where it differs is in its incredibly simplistic preparation and bland taste, if you can call it a taste to begin with. Making hardtack was easy. All you had to do was mix a couple cups of flour with 3/4 cups of water, with 1.5 teaspoons of salt dashed in for good measure. This would net you about 10 to 12 square pieces, so as you can imagine, when prepped for long journeys and storage, much larger batches are made at a time with higher ingredient amounts. Once the mixture was fully incorporated, the baker would touch the dough to make sure it was both a little dry and without any stick. Then, it would be rolled out on a tabletop until the dough was about a 1/2 inch thick. The dough slab would then be cut into 3x3 inch squares, thrown onto a tray, and heated multiple times in a kiln or oven until the consistency was firm to the touch. In fact, it was so hard, the bread would be inedible without liquid to soften it. It used to be said that one could fire a musket directly into a slab of hardtack, and the musket ball wouldn't ever make it through to the other side. The most common way to soften the hardtack was dipping it in brine or coffee, or frying it on a skillet with other rations. In the late 1700s, it was ground to a fine pulp and used to thicken seafood chowders in the New England communities. Soldiers in the Mexican-American War, and by proxy the Civil War, would crush the hardtack under the butts of their rifles before tossing it in a frying pan, making mushy, gross hardtack pancakes. Others would let it roast on the campfire coals themselves. The luckiest soldiers would turn their hardtack into a dessert. If one was fortunate enough to come across some brown sugar or whiskey, they'd combine the hardtack with whatever sweet element was available to turn into a pudding, as they called it. Hardtack wasn't meant to be enjoyed as fine cuisine or an easy-to-eat biscuit, however. It was designed to last incredibly long periods of time, as long as it stayed dry. If it did, hardtack could last for years, especially if it was cooked 4 or 5 times rather than the customary twice-baked recipes. Usually, hardtack was made 6 months in advance of using the rations, and was a staple for travels that involved inconsistent handling and drastic temperature changes, especially involving heat and humidity. Thus, it's what made hardtack the perfect staple for migrating parties across the Old West, and throughout the American frontier in general. Folks on the eastern seaboard could cook up a massive batch of hardtack to last them the months-long journey across the country. The Oregon Trail was a popular place to find families and expeditioners supplied with hardtack, as were mining parties dotting the western landscape. The California Gold Rush was the real heyday for hardtack, as it could feed the mining camps for weeks on end without the need for big game hunting or excess foraging. One of the more famous instances of widespread hardtack trade came in 1801, when businessman and baker Josiah Bent started an outfit in Milton, Massachusetts, where he became famous for his water crackers. These water crackers were sold at a premium to the aforementioned gold prospectors and wagon trains due to head west, and Josiah made a fortune on just flour, water, and salt alone, eventually forming the G.H. Bent Company. Down the line, the G.H. Bent Company became famous for their authentic hardtack crackers resembling the same hardtack eaten by soldiers during the Civil War. The Civil War is usually the time period most people associate with hardtack and water crackers at large. Of course, soldiers hated the idea of eating inedible slabs of rock-hard dough, and their distaste was turned into a few different Civil War-era songs, such as the parody of Stephen Foster's Hard Times Come Again No More, sung as Hardtack Come Again No More. What most folks don't know about the Civil War hardtack is that it wasn't all made at the time of war. In fact, a good chunk of early Civil War hardtack was leftovers from the Mexican-American War that ended in 1848, some 13 years before the Union fought the Confederacy. As a result, a lot of the hardtack the suffering soldiers were subjected to were infested with worms, especially if the hardtack in question had been stored incorrectly. To avoid eating the worms or other harmful parasites, the soldiers would drop their hardtack into their morning coffee, watch as the weevil larva floated to the top of the cup, then wipe off the worms to be able to eat and drink the rest of the concoction parasite-free. Despite its popularity in 19th century America, hardtack wasn't an invention of the 1800s. Its origins can be traced all the way back to the first processed cereals and creation of flour from wheat, barley, and other grains.
The earliest versions of hardtack are thought to be duracakes, made of brittle bread by Egyptian sailors. Biscuit of muslin, a grain mixture of bean flour, rye, and barley, as recorded by King Richard I during the Third Crusade in 1189, and the bread rations provided to the Royal Navy ships starting in 1588, which allowed sailors a pound of hardtack and a gallon of low-alcohol beer. Even as the years have gone on, hardtack's simplistic recipe has remained the same. It's very rarely seen in the average American diet as of present day, but it's not completely extinct from store shelves or the occasional kitchen pantry. The place you're most likely to find modern hardtack is one of the final American frontiers, up north in the state of Alaska. It's where the Richmond, Virginia-based hardtack company, called Inner Bake Foods, sends 98% of its Sailor Boy hardtack supplies. Alaskans still eat hardtack as a portion of their diet due to the rugged terrain and transportation issues Alaska poses to food suppliers. It's lasted so long in Alaskan households that many folks choose hardtack even when shipments of tastier, more diverse foods are made available in the area. Alaska also features a state law requiring all small aircrafts to maintain survival gear on board the plane. This almost always includes the Sailor Boy hardtack, now made synonymous with images of log cabins, airfields, and remote villages across the state of Alaska. The one caveat to Sailor Boy hardtack is its recipe now involves vegetable shortening and leavening, making it not quite the same authentic hardtack you'd see in Civil War reenactments happening in the continental United States to this day. It's for good reason too. Modern technology and food science has brought us well past the age of needing to store bland foods for years at a time. There are no more starving wagon trains or famished mining camps or rundown soldiers to turn to hardtack, making it the perfect symbol of the Wild West's simple, yet satiating cuisine. You've heard it once and you will hear it 1,000 times more. It's hard to talk about the Wild West period in American history without mentioning its inherent lawlessness and vigilantism that came along with it. Whether it was a Rolodex of outlaws or bandits ruffling the feathers of innocent homesteaders, or Native Americans raiding wagon caravans, or greedy prospectors hiding gold in the hills, anything and everything was fair play on the western frontier. Some of the most fascinating lawlessness, however, came in the form of train robberies. Starting in October 1866 with the Reno Brothers train robbery in Jackson County, Indiana, and bleeding well into the 20th century, outlaws and amateurs alike saw the immediate fortune of a successful train robbery unparalleled to any other grift or long con. There were a few train robberies so infamous they left behind massive legacies through both stories and art, their participants more famous than some modern-day celebrities, despite the sometimes violent and deadly nature of the crimes. To further dissect their infamy, here are two tales of train robberies in the United States Wild West. The story of the Big Springs train robbery takes us back to the Nebraska Territory just before it was officially admitted to the Union in the mid-1860s. To the western end of present-day Nebraska, right on the cusp of Colorado country, was a small settlement known as Lone Tree. Lone Tree sat on land occupied by local Native American tribes for centuries, located right next to a large natural spring, which would provide water and nourishment for traveling caravans along the California and Oregon trails of the 19th century. The settlement received its name from the lone cottonwood tree that towered over the otherwise empty plains, providing a landmark for those crossing the prairie, whether it be stagecoach trails or the Pony Express. Eventually, the Union Pacific Railroad engineered their routes right through the heart of Lone Tree and named the depot spot Big Springs after the nearby water sources in 1867. The thought was that the water would provide quick and easy resources for the steam-powered trains. 9 years later, in 1876, two cowboys hailing from the Lone Star State, named Sam Bass and Joel Collins, led a cattle drive through the Big Springs area, heading north for the auctions and cattle markets. They paid no attention to the remote train station, but marked its location in the backs of their minds after passing through. Once up north, the two wranglers sold the cattle herd for $8,000 and were instructed to return most of the profits to Texas, where the cattle's original owners awaited their prize money.
Unlucky for the Texas businessmen, Bass and Collins took the money and ran instead, seeing the $8,000 as an investment in their long-running scheme to prospect for gold in the Black Hills of the Dakota Territory. It was here the bad luck turned on the cowboys-turned-thieves, who arrived in present-day South Dakota and found not an ounce of gold. Of course, their $8,000 didn't last long when the rivers ran dry, and Bass and Collins were left with little choice besides embracing the outlaw lifestyle and committing crimes indefinitely. To kick off their newfound legacy, the pair picked a number of other outlaws to join their up-and-coming crew, namely Tom Nixon, Jim Barry, Jack Davis, and Bill Heffridge. The gang, referred to as the Black Hill Bandits, targeted stagecoach stations from around the Great Plains, hitting 7 in just a few months' time. This included 4 separate hits on the same line, the infamous Deadwood Station in Deadwood, South Dakota. The 5th attempt ended in the murder of Johnny Slaughter on March 25, 1877, and the profits were no longer seen as worthwhile by the Black Hill Bandits. Rather, they were attracted by the big-time potential of train robberies, despite no guarantees that they would get away alive. Lucky for the Black Hill Bandits was their leader, Sam Bass, and his knowledge of a quiet train depot tucked away in the Nebraska plains. Bass remembered his trek through the Lone Tree Settlement a year prior, and brought the boys down south to Big Springs in September of 1877. As the sun went down on September 18th, the Black Hill Bandits snuck into the Big Springs train station where the station master, John Barnhart, was supervising the current shift. The outlaws surprised Barnhart and restrained him without much of a fight, and proceeded to destroy the telegraph. Once Barnhart was subdued by the loaded arms of the Black Hill Bandits, he was instructed to signal the incoming eastbound train to stop at Big Springs, without alerting them of anything wrong. The express train eventually rolled in and stopped at around 10:45 p.m. A few minutes later, at 10:48 p.m., Sam Bass and company hopped aboard the train, making way directly to the mail-safe car. Here, they gathered up a measly $450 that was stashed in the small mail safe, but hedged their bet with a much bigger safe located in another train cart. In a stroke of misfortune, though, the large safe was unbreakable, as it had been secured with a time lock that was only set to open once the train arrived at its final destination. Unsatisfied with the result, the Black Hill Bandits punished the assigned express manager until he cooperated, but even after a violent pistol whipping, he was unable to open the safe. Of course, Sam Bass had already come so far, he wasn't about to give up. They nearly made it through the entire train empty-handed until one of the men noticed 3 plain wooden boxes sitting off to the side of the locked safe. Within these wooden boxes were newly minted $20 gold pieces, totaling $60,000 altogether, which would be over $1.5 million in today's cash. Bass and company couldn't believe the gold hadn't been protected in the safe, but didn't waste any time asking rhetorical questions. After the gold pieces were secured, the bandits turned to the passengers. Nobody put up much of a fight, and the men quickly acquired an additional $1,300 and 4 pristine gold watches from the innocent travelers. After everything in the train had been cleared, the Black Hill Bandits rode away from the robbery without issuing a fatality. They made a quick pit stop in Lone Tree, dividing their loot equally amongst the 6 outlaws, right underneath the shade of the cottonwood tree that had launched the depot's history in the first place. From Big Springs, the Black Hill Bandits split off into pairs. Sam Bass headed south with Jack Davis, as the 2 men disguised themselves as farmers, with their gold stashed beneath the seat of their run-down, beat-up, one-horse buggy. In Texas, Sam Bass returned to his old abode, but not before Jack Davis attempted to persuade Bass to flee to South America with him. Bass declined, and Jack Davis was never seen again. Joel Collins and Bill Heffridge, another Black Hills pairing, weren't as lucky. 8 days after the Big Springs train robbery, a 10-man sheriff's posse, led by Sheriff Bardsley in Buffalo Station, Kansas, tracked down the 2 outlaws and killed them in a high plains shootout. The posse recovered upwards of $20,000, which was then returned to Union Pacific Railroad Company. Jim Barry met a similar fate. On his way southeast, Jim was detected in Mexico, Missouri, and captured by law enforcement. He attempted to escape, but was wounded in the process, succumbing to his injuries and dying just 2 days later. The final member, Tim Nixon, was last heard to be running north to Canada. His story was never resolved, however,
as his $10,000 went unrecovered and the man was never heard from again after September 1867. The legacy of the Big Springs train robbery is now fastened into the lore of the Wild West. Of all its participants, Sam Bass saw the most notoriety blossom from his crimes. No longer would Sam Bass be remembered as the haphazard gambler who stumbled around racetracks or dance halls, failing to succeed despite scheme after scheme. Rather, he saw his legacy become similar to the likes of Robin Hood. Many would claim after Big Springs that Sam spent most of his money like he never had before, often paying for goods and services well above market price to benefit the less than fortunate on the other side of the counter. Of course, these feelings have been lost to the nostalgia of the Old West, as Sam Bass was really nothing more than just another outlaw. It's been said that after Big Springs, Bass returned to a life of robbery and holdups, not for the money, but for the thrill. He felt an adrenaline rush like no other, with all of the wanted signs featuring his face and bounty hunters hot on his trail. It's all just another chapter in the story of the mayhem provided by the Big Springs train robbery. In the criminal career of train robbing, no land was more ripe for action than the remote deserts of Arizona in the 1880s and 1890s. The most skilled of these Arizona train robbers were Burt Alford and Billy Stiles, former deputy sheriffs in the town of Wilcox. The pair had grown tired of the long hours and low pay that came with law enforcement in the Old West, and decided to shift towards a life of crime. Alford and Stiles immediately set their sights on the Southern Pacific Railroad, which had countless routes dispersed throughout the state. One such route went directly through Cochise, an unincorporated community at the southeastern tip of Arizona Territory. For 10 years, outlaws had ignored the government statute making train robbing punishable by death, and by 1899, Cochise was the perfect strike for Alford and Stiles to remain undetected by authorities. The two lawmen turned bandits hired 2 additional henchmen to ransack a westbound Southern Pacific Express along with them, and on September 9, 1899, the plan went into motion. The express messenger, a man by the name of Charles Adair, was quickly greeted with the end of a revolver as he opened the passenger car door. Alford and Stiles then held up the entire crew, lining them up along the platform with arms raised until they detached the express car and drove it a few miles west into a remote, desolate stretch of track. After a few unsuccessful tries at the safe's combination located in the car, the bandits lined the car with dynamite and blew the safe door off its hinges. Within the safe, the 4 men found $10,000 worth of cash and gold pieces. Cochise Sheriff Scott White and U.S. Deputy Marshal George Scarborough chased the outlaws into the Chiricahua Mountains, but never picked up a scent, a failure that would soon bear further consequences on southern Arizona. The Cochise train robbery provided enough success to Burt Alford and Billy Stiles that they wasted no time in plotting their next big hit, this time targeting a nearby town called Fairbank, right off the shores of the San Pedro River. They teamed up with a local cattleman by the name of Bill Downing, who had helped the men organize the hit on Cochise. Alford and Stiles wanted to change up their strategy. It had long been thought that most train robberies targeted train cars on the outskirts of major populations, out where law enforcement's reach was too far and escape was just a few feet away. However, the two outlaws believed gathering at a bigger train station would provide human shields between the criminals and the coppers, and knew the reward inside had the potential to be bigger. Thus, the men turned their attention to an incoming Wells Fargo Express train heading west towards Fort Huachuca, a U.S. Army post just 20 miles away from Fairbank. They believed it was carrying the United States Army payroll, providing quite the handsome reward. This time, Alford and Stiles wanted to distance themselves from the action and return to Wilcox under their usual deputy sheriff titles. Meanwhile, they hired 5 other bandits to carry out the actual heist, including Bob Burns Brown, Bravo Juan Tom Yoas, brothers George and Lewis Owens, and Three-Fingered Jack Dunlop. On February 15, 1900, the night of the Fairbank train robbery, the 5 outlaws rode into town under the guise of drunken cowboys, stumbling around to fit in with the crowd, but not as to draw too much attention to themselves. There, they waited for the Wells Fargo train to roll into the depot. As it did, the messenger inside, Jeff Milton, opened the express car doors
and stepped outside as the train came to a complete stop. It's then that the 5 outlaws revealed their true motives, pulling out their guns and aiming point blank at Milton, demanding his surrender. At first, Milton believed the holdup to be nothing more than a ruse, but his mind quickly changed when one of the bandits fired a round that blew the messenger's hat off. He was just the substitute filling in for his friend, the full-time express messenger, and wasn't expecting a full-on robbery. Knowing his revolver was on the desk in the back of the car, Milton had to think quickly, and hesitated before lunging at the sawed-off shotgun propped up next to the door he was standing at. Unfortunately for Milton, the 3-second pause was enough to arouse suspicion, and the 5 outlaws started shooting at his position. One bullet hit square on Milton's left shoulder, shattering his arm and putting him on the ground. Just as Three-Finger Jack was climbing aboard the train, however, Milton grabbed the shotgun with his remaining arm and fired a round directly at the outlaw. 11 of the 12 pellets tore through his body, while the remainder struck Bravo Juan above his thigh. As Burns and the Owens brothers continued to fire at the opened express car, Bravo Juan hobbled to his horse on one leg. Meanwhile, Milton was able to slide the metal car door shut, craft a homemade tourniquet for his injured arm, and hide the safe key underneath the luggage, all before passing out. When the uninjured outlaws reopened the car door and boarded the train, they saw Milton's unmoving body and figured he was dead. When they couldn't find the safe key, they gave up on the endeavor altogether and loaded the gravely injured Three-Finger Jack on his horse before the gang of 5 rode away into the midnight sky with nothing more than 17 Mexican pesos. To avoid capture, the outlaws fled to the Dragoon Mountains. They left Three-Finger Jack behind at the foothills with a bottle of whiskey, as he was too wounded to push forward, and the other 4 pressed on. The efforts were all for naught, however, when Cochise Sheriff Scott White finally caught up to the men as they struggled to cross a pass in the Dragoons. Down below, his men captured Three-Finger Jack, passed out from his alcohol, and the Fairbank train robbery was over as quickly as it had begun. Of course, the aftermath was almost just as explosive as the crime itself. After law enforcement refused to believe Three-Finger Jack's claim that Bert Alford was the rightful ringleader, Billy Stiles turned himself in to confess, unhappy with his measly $480 split of the original Cochise train robbery cash. The sheriff's office was pleased with Stiles' confession and allowed him to go free, arresting Alford and throwing him in the jailhouse in Tombstone, Arizona, along with the rest of the outlaws. The arrests were fruitless, however, when Stiles showed his true allegiance a couple of months later when he arrived in Tombstone, shot the deputy marshal, and freed Alfred and Bravo Juan. The other men were left in custody, and the 3 escapees went on the run for the next couple of years. Alfred and Stiles went on to rob more trains before Stiles was killed as a lawman under the name of William Larkin, and Alfred moved to Central America in 1910 and worked on the Panama Canal. Jeff Milton, the injured express messenger, was made a folk hero in his own right, receiving the praise and graces of many in southeastern Arizona for sticking up to the bandits and protecting the Wells Fargo Keep. Without a doubt, the story of the Fairbank train robbery was unlike most, as the good guys prevailed and the bad guys were left scrambling around the Old West, thinking about that next express train that could be their ticket to paradise and away from the mayhem of the western frontier. When you close your eyes and picture the weaponry featured heavily in America's Wild West, you most likely imagine settlers and their inclination towards guns and artillery. Your mind might harken back to the early days of Smith & Wesson or Samuel Colt, when the widespread manufacturing of firearms spurred the US government and smaller outfits of outlaws and bandits with a bevy of weaponry options. Despite the generational outburst of better guns and developed artillery, however, they weren't the only options available to the folks traversing the western frontier, whether it be hunters, soldiers, or both. Rather, some of the most fascinating and unique weapon choices came from the warrior bands across hundreds of Native American tribes, who utilized a diverse set of weapons for both sourcing their food and defending their homeland. To garner a better understanding of what these types of weapons were and how they were used, we're breaking down the major groups of arms and protection systems of indigenous Americans. Thus, here are the 5 types of Native American weaponry from the Old West.
The first of the weapons are the most referenced arms when conjuring images of Native Americans on the battlefield, coming in the form of range weapons. Range weaponry was broken down even further into two subcategories, short range and long range. Bows and arrows are the first protection systems that come to mind. While the complex tools of bows and arrows have been around for an estimated 8,000 years or longer, Indigenous Americans were just one of hundreds of civilizations from around the world to utilize the weapons in day-to-day life. That being said, however, by far and away, the native tribes were the major players in the bow and arrow game across the Old West. Arrows are constructed using a stone shaved down to form a sharp blade, also referred to as the arrow tip. The arrow is then fastened to one end of a skinny wooden shaft, while feathers are fastened to the opposite end to help shape an arrow's flight path and keep it aerodynamic. Bows are built from wood as well, not from bone, as some history accounts have incorrectly stated. The wood is shaped and softened for flexibility and connected with a single taut strand of string. The string is the most vital piece to bows and arrows, usually made from animal intestines, nettle fibers, bone tissue, or horsehair. These materials are dried out, twisted, pulled back out, and then twisted a second time before completing the construction of the bow. Other range weapons include spears and lances, used in both war and big game hunting. Spears and lances are built just like arrows, however, certain tribes foregoed the stone tip and instead simply sharpened the end of the wooden shaft. Lances were more of the same as spears, however, they were usually prioritized for horseback warriors. The shaft of a lance was normally longer than that of a spear, allowing for a fighter to stab their enemies while still perched comfortably atop their bronco. A secondary weapon in conjunction with spears was also heavily utilized by Native Americans, a device commonly known as an antlat, also called spear throwers. Spear throwers gave warriors leverage when throwing their spears or lances at long range, adding much-needed velocity to their attacks. Spear throwers are constructed from hollowed-out wood, finished with a grooved cup at the tip that can hold the spear in place before launching it forward. The wielder will then extend their throwing arm forward, which provides the leverage needed to give the spear additional velocity. Spear throwers can also be constructed on a smaller scale, with darts and miniature spears utilized by shorter users and training guides. Opposite of range weaponry is close combat weaponry, also called striking weapons. Striking weapons were most often seen during fights between tribes and amongst fellow Indigenous Americans, and could even be thrown if the wielder maintained top-notch accuracy. The most iconic of the striking weapons was the war hatchet. War hatchets resembled the axes the European colonists brought with them via early colonization, and were revolutionized versions of ancient grooved axes seen in the area from nearly 10,000 years ago. War hatchets were normally made of a wooden or stone handle, topped with a similar stone blade sharpened to cut even the toughest of material. Sometimes, the blade was constructed with iron, especially after the heyday of Western migration in America in the 19th century. Similar to war hatchets were pipe tomahawks, a version of a hatchet that also worked as a smoking pipe. Tomahawks were the most likely to be used as short-range weapons of all the striking arms, and were also utilized in the skinning of animals for both their meat and their fur. Depending on the tribe, pipe tomahawks were gradually removed from battlefield strategies and became incredibly ceremonial objects amongst the indigenous. Pipe smoking is heavily featured in countless cultures around the American West, and continues to hold much significance in tales of the Old West and the pre-colonial lives of Native Americans. If a warrior wielded a striking weapon that wasn't a hatchet or tomahawk, they most likely carried a club at their side. The most common type of club was the stone club, involving a heavy or dense stone wrapped taut to the end of a wooden handle. The handle had to be sturdy too, otherwise it wouldn't withstand even a single blow. When building a stone club, warriors were instructed to use flint and other types of quartz available to them. In the present day, scholars believe stone clubs were actually predominantly ceremonial, much like the pipe tomahawk, and rarely used on the warpath. The sister club to stone clubs was the wooden club. These were fashioned exactly like their stone counterparts, However, the end was sometimes sharpened to form a sharp blade. These clubs were the weapon of choice by the woodland tribes, frequently made from oak and maple trees. The cousin club to both weapons was the gunstock war club, not used until the 18th and 19th centuries in America. The Central and Northern Plains tribes modeled these arms after the stock of 18th century muskets, brought over west by European settlers. The purpose of creating gunstock war clubs is debated amongst many. Some believe they were actually created as a way to intimidate rival tribes and warrior bands, making it appear as if they actually wielded real guns. Others believe the gunstock war clubs were made out of sheer surprise at the effectiveness of muskets used as striking weapons themselves. The tribes might have felt the stock shape was perfect for close combat, and modeled the clubs for a similar approach. The most often used weapon amongst indigenous tribes of the American West weren't solely seen on the battlefield, but rather equally used between fighting and hunting. This type of arms is categorized as cutting weaponry, usually represented by both long and short-bladed knives. A very select few tribes adapted the sword-wielding tactics of Europeans, who first flocked to the shores of America in the 16th and 17th centuries, but these practices did not spread very far west. Most 19th century to modern-day Native American tribes preferred shorter blades, and these weapons repeatedly came in the form of knives. Knives were a vital tool to indigenous life. They were frequently used in the killing of game and the preparation of food. They helped hunters skin their captured animals and remove meat for either immediate consumption or long-term storage. They were also wielded as weapons to be used in close combat, stealth missions, and as a last line of defense. Knives were also instrumental in various intimidation tactics, such as the collection of scalps amongst certain bands of warrior tribes. However, it should be noted the idea of scalping was not as widespread as it sometimes is reported, and certainly wasn't emblematic of all knife wielders across the frontier. Knives were usually constructed of natural hard materials, such as big game bone or deer antlers. Some tribes built their short blades with refined stone, tightly woven into a wooden handle chiseled from tree trunks. A few decades after the migration of settlers across the United States, some indigenous tribes constructed their knives from iron or steel, inspired by the Europeans before them. Other bands crafted their knives from the iron and copper deposits found in the meteorites that had crashed into the Earth's crust. Switching from the offensive side to the defensive side are a different type of weapon, utilized more to deflect the assault of opponents rather than deal damage of any significant amount. These types of weapons usually came in the form of shields, more specifically referred to as war shields by various tribes. While not all warriors on the battlefield chose to carry shields, as they would sometimes take away agility or stealth, they did provide a hefty amount of protection from slower projectiles and striking weapons used by opposing tribesmen or pioneers. Many of these shields were constructed with a circular base formed by a wooden frame that chiseled until the edges were rounded and smooth. A tougher material, usually leather or cowhide, was then wrapped taut across the frame, accented with paint, feathers, and other distinguishable features. Many tribes called these creations war shields, as they were most often seen carried into battle in various conflicts across both the American West and other North American territories. War shields were designed to not only deflect arrows or lesser projectiles, but also constructed to redirect spears and other hand-to-hand combat options. Warriors on horseback were especially fond of shields, as it didn't hinder their movement or attack styles, as shields might for foot soldiers. The more experienced shield makers amongst tribes of the Great Plains used neck leather from the American buffalo, a much tougher and more prolific material than regular cowhide or cotton, as was used by the more eastward tribes. Of course, these extra tough war shields declined significantly in popularity in the latter half of the 19th century, as the systematic destruction of the American buffalo by the US government targeted not just the indigenous food supply, but their top resource for weapons customization as well. After the loss of buffalo, the Great Plains tribes turned to elk and horsehide despite their lesser quality. For Pueblo tribes and other bands located in the American Southwest, war shields were often made of wicker, in combination with the aforementioned rawhide and heavy layers of cotton fiber. Amongst the Dakota tribes of the Northern Plains, young men constructing a war shield became a vital event in their growth and maturation as potential warriors. At a young age, they would conduct a ceremony known as shield smoking. Shield smoking consisted of digging a hole 2 feet deep and 2 feet wide, building a fire within its walls, and letting the shield's rawhide stretch horizontally over the fire's flames, using pegs to hold down the edges of the skin. As the rawhide was smoked, the young warrior is joined by his best friend at the fire pit, and the two engage in song and dance. This ceremonial act is to ask the power of the Great Spirit to strike the shield, giving the newfound soldier ultimate protection from his enemies. After the dance, glue is spread across the smoked hide and the builder waits for it to dry, creating the thick, durable foundation of the war shield. Of all the defensive materials utilized by fighters across the Wild West, this war shield is most likely the best. Dakota shield smoking ceremonies are very much connected to the fifth and final type of weaponry utilized by various Native American tribes, another form of shield called medicine shields. Medicine shields and their similar counterparts are much more symbolic in their usage, carried by warriors not to deflect bolts or blows, but rather harness the spiritual energy necessary to survive the battlefield. Like war shields, medicine shields are carefully constructed in ceremonial settings, utilizing a circular frame, a leather facing, and paint and feathers to display the expression and identity of the individuals that wield them. If a medicine shield has been properly built, its user will engage in conflict with a spiritual protection, guided by gods and spirits of certain tribes' cultures. The main difference between the physical nature of each shield is their weight. War shields are made dense with a combination of thick rawhide and plenty of adhesive substances. Medicine shields are made lighter, with thinner leather stretched across the frame. The lighter nature of medicine shields makes it possible for foot soldiers to carry such weapons, as they do not add much hindrance or dead weight to the warriors known for their fleet of foot. When it comes to the specific symbols seen painted on medicine shields, the exact decoration depends wholly on the wielder's spiritual journey. If the user has a long history of understanding medicine and spiritualism, their strength may be displayed with gods or goddesses representing the ultimate warrior. If the user is newer to medicine or lacks a mature knowledge of their spiritual quest, their shield may be more plain. As the user grows in their wisdom and refines their skills on the battlefield, their medicine shields will become more ornate and filled with spiritual power. Symbolic weapons may be the most misunderstood of all Native American arms, but are the best representation of the indigenous way of life and their connection with the spiritual worlds, culture at the forefront rather than the easier path to bloodshed and violence. For millennia, stories have been passed down from generation to generation across America's western frontier. Whether it's been oral traditions informing the culture of indigenous tribes, or Spanish mythology that came through Mexico, or European literature that spawned countless campfire stories across the pond, the folklore of the American West is tough to beat. More specifically, stemming from the indigenous oral traditions are the folktales and parables passed down by the Navajo tribes of the American Southwest Territories. Literary works and oral legends are integral parts to the culture of the Navajo, and have influenced storytelling both in the United States and around the world at large. These traditions range from creation stories, like the Diné Bahane, to connected lessons featuring frequently seen characters of Navajo myths, such as the Black God and Coyote figures. To celebrate these fascinating pieces of folklore and legendary narratives, we're going to take a deeper dive into a couple of entries into Navajo mythology, and the lessons passed on through these parables of diverse voices. Here are 2 Native American folktales of the Navajo tribe. The first legend is that of the Little Dawn Boy and the Rainbow Trail, a magnificent tale about a child who must trek to the top of a mountain and ask the chief who resides there to bless his family through nature with all the colors of the rainbow. The tale of the Rainbow Trail was popularized in the mainstream literary world in 1917, when it was adapted by Francis Jenkins Olcott in his 64-title collection of children's short stories from around the world. The legend begins in a nondescript land inhabited by indigenous Americans, where a house made of rugged red rock rested on the side of a deep, cavernous canyon. In the house lived Little Don Boy, a curious yet courageous youthful spirit who never feared questions or quests. With Little Don Boy in the Red Rock house was his entire family, consisting of his father, mother, various brothers, a few sisters, and most importantly, a tall, commanding medicine man, who always seemed larger than life himself. Little Don Boy received his name from his morning ritual, in which he would sit on the edge of the canyon and peer to the other side, looking over the land his ancestors had roamed for generations. In the distance and beyond the far side of the canyon was a mountain, colored in a hue of deep purple. Behind the purple mountain was a gargantuan white tower that resembled a cliff, its top camouflaged by the clouds. The mysterious mountain and its white tower always intrigued Little Don Boy, who would ask the medicine man each morning who lived on top of the white cliff. The medicine man wasn't ready to give out that information quite yet, however. Instead, he looked down at the boy and told him, he will say who lives in the White Tower only when the boy learns his magic songs in exchange. Little Don Boy did exactly as he was told, learning the magic songs by heart. After a short time of practice, Little Don Boy returned and performed his magic songs, impressing the medicine man. The medicine man then told the boy the person who lives on top of the tower was the great chief of all magic, residing in the House of Evening Light. Inside of the house were 4 rooms, complemented with 4 doors. The first door was guarded by 2 bolts of lightning shining brighter than the sun. The second door was protected by 2 unrelenting bears. The third door was shielded by 2 red-headed serpents, and the fourth by 2 fearsome rattlesnakes consumed by wrath. While Little Don Boy remained courageous, he did have a pressing question, wondering how he would reach the top of the tower. The medicine man again came equipped with a reply, telling the boy he needed to bring with him gifts for the great chief, while also leaving behind the magical pollen of dawn on the trail that he leaves behind. Then, at the peak of the Purple Mountain, he must sing the magic songs he practiced to reveal the path forward and upward, right to the House of Evening Light. To prepare, Little Don Boy dressed himself in his finest feathers and face paint, gathering his bows and arrows, and making one last appointment with the medicine man. The medicine man then gave him 2 bags, one with the gifts of wampum string and bright blue turquoise, and the other bag with the pollen of dawn, golden dust from foraged larkspur flowers. Afterwards, Little Don Boy trekked into the canyon, befriending the wild grasshoppers dancing around him as he made his way through dew-soaked fields. By the morning of the 4th day, Little Don Boy's adventure brought him to the foot of the Purple Mountain. As he looked up, the boy saw the red lightning striking the clouds that covered the summit, awestruck by its power and brilliance. Unafraid, Little Don Boy went forward, being sure to sprinkle the golden pollen as he climbed. He remembered the magic song as well, singing from the depths of his soul. The song went as follows. "Oh, little pollen boy am I, from Red Rock House I come, with pollen of dawn on my trail, with beauty before me, with beauty behind me, with beauty below me, with beauty above me, with beauty all around me, over the rainbow trail I go. Hither I wander, over the beautiful trail I go." As soon as the song was finished, a luminous rainbow saturated with its vibrant colors arose from the top of the Purple Mountain, creating a path straight up to the top of the white cliff. Little Don Boy didn't have to guess what it was. He had finally found the Rainbow Trail. Unable to contain his excitement, the boy ventured across the colorful bridge with haste. Along the way, a shimmering wind filled with a rainbow mist blew through the trail and up towards the House of Evening Light. When Little Don Boy approached the house,
he found all 4 doors were no longer inaccessible, as the rainbow mist had blinded all 4 pairs of creatures guarding the 4 passages. Once inside, Little Dawn Boy discovered a new trail of daylight, over which he spread more golden pollen of dawn and sang the medicine man's magic song. At the song's conclusion, the boy was met with the commanding, hardened voice of the great chief of all magic, who asked what stranger could have possibly arrived in his house, uninvited. The great chief appeared angry and unforgiving, shocked that a mere mortal could complete such a journey. Little Dawn Boy, of course, did not flinch. Instead, remembering the gifts in his second bag at his side, he took out the wampum strings and bright blue turquoise, telling the great chief he arrived with offerings and the intention to only make friends, not enemies. When the great chief of all magic saw the gifts, his fierce demeanor dissolved into a pleasant welcoming, smiling at Little Dawn Boy and inviting him further into the House of Evening Light. As they walked, the great chief asked the boy what he'd like in return. Without hesitation, Little Dawn Boy turned to his elder and asked for plentiful gifts for his family and fellow tribesmen. He requested offerings stemming from all the colors of the rainbow, and then some, such as yellow and white and blue corn, green plants, gorgeous flowers of the finest fragrances, clouds of black filled with fearsome thunderstorms and radiant lightning, as well as softer clouds, bringing blue spring showers, easygoing summer breezes, and crisp autumn hazes of gold and amber. The great chief of all magic could only crack a bigger smile, proud of Little Dawn Boy's courage and compassion for his clan. The 2 unlikely friends devoured a fantastic feast, eating and drinking until they were merry, and Little Dawn Boy could prepare for his adventure back to the far side of the canyon. The boy couldn't leave without one more song, however, and as he stepped out of the House of Evening Light, he looked down from the White Tower and sang as follows. "Oh, Little Dawn Boy am I, from the House of Evening Light. On the trail of evening light, to Red Rock House I return. Held fast in my hands are gifts, with soft rains above me, and sweet flowers below me, with white corn behind me, with green plants before me, with pale mists all around me. Over the rainbow trail I go. Hither I wander, over the beautiful trail I go." As he finished, the rainbow trail once again emerged from the edges of the cliff and descended back down towards the summit of the Purple Mountain. Little Dawn Boy bid adieu to the great chief and his fortress one final time, before continuing along the bridge. Another 3 days and 3 nights passed on by, until the 4th morning, the boy arrived at the end of the deep canyon just as the sun peaked above the horizon. Little Dawn Boy entered the Red Rock House and found his family eagerly awaiting his return. They laid out the magical buckskin on the floor for the boy to rest upon, listening to his traveling stories as their eyes gleamed with the gifts from the tower above. Little Dawn Boy's adventure across the Rainbow Trail became a legend from then on in the lands of the Deep Canyon and beyond, with many a folk singing his famous tune as follows. "With soft rains above us, with sweet flowers below us, with white corn behind us, with green plants before us, with pale mists all around us, over the rainbow trail we go. Hither we wander, over the beautiful trail we go." In the heart of Navajo Nation stands an 800 feet high natural structure called Spider Rock, located within Canyon de Chelly National Park, Arizona. The structure has long been heralded for its bizarre visuals and unique formation, of which geologists believe began more than 230 million years ago. They believe it was the result of compressed sand swirling in the canyon winds, the red dust of Arizona's deserts, creating a breathtaking monolith only Mother Nature could concoct. The Navajo people have a much different origin story, however, as Spider Rock has become an important facet in their folklore and cultural history at large. The legend of Spider Rock begins in the early days of the Navajo's population of the lands in America's Southwest, when their ancestors entered the Fourth World from the Third World in their creation. During this era, they lived in the cliffs of the region, constructing caves and various dwellings throughout the canyons. These usually existed above the canyon floor,
to avoid the dangers of flash floods and the perils of looming enemies. These enemies came in the form of various monsters and mythological beasts, savage creatures that hunted people like game. One of the deities looking out for the people was Spider-Woman, a goddess with supernatural powers and deep love for her humans below. One day, she sought out 2 humans born of a deity, named Monster Slayer and Child Born of Water. They were given a quest to find their father, Sun God, who was to guide them to their warrior training. After a trying and treacherous journey, the 2 men found Sun God and asked him to train them in the ways of killing monsters. Sun God obliged, teaching Monster Slayer and Child Born of Water exactly how to destroy the beasts of both land and sea. Ultimately, the training ended and the 2 empowered warriors were ready to tackle the monsters of the canyons. They returned to Spider-Woman's domain and ended the creature's terror, establishing Spider-Woman as one of the most respected and important deities in Navajo lore. After her victory in protecting the people of the Fourth World, Spider-Woman looked for a home, eventually choosing the sandstone monolith now known as Spider Rock. It was from upon her roost in Spider Rock that Spider-Woman taught the ancestors of modern Navajo how to weave upon a loom, a lesson she learned from her former husband, Spider-Man. Spider-Man was known for crossing the poles of earth and sky, warping the sunray sticks as a wolf cross, and maintaining fibers from rock crystals and sheet lightning. For the batten, he sealed joints with a sun halo, and used a white shell for the comb. This led directly to the heightened weaving culture of the Navajo. Spider-Woman was also the focal point in shaping the behavior of young children. Kids would be told that if their behavior did not improve, Spider-Woman would descend from her web-covered ladder and bring the Navajo children back up with her, where they'd be devoured on top of Spider Rock. To add in a bit of visual proof so that the children wouldn't get any ideas, elders would point to the top of Spider Rock, where white rocks covered its crown. They told the kids that these were sun-bleached bones left behind by Spider-Woman, as warning signs to the children below. Spider-Woman, while used as a tactic to keep children in line, wasn't made out to be one of the horrifying beasts she helped slay. In fact, there were more stories of her protection over the Navajo youth than any others before her. One such story goes that a young Navajo man was trekking through Dead Man's Canyon by his lonesome, hunting for game to bring back to his tribe. While he was canvassing the region, however, an enemy tribesman popped out from behind the brush, chasing the young man deep into Dead Man's Canyon. The young hunter was startled, but not shocked, and turned to run as fast as he'd ever run before. All the while, his eyes darted around the canyon for any sign of escape, like a perch or tunnel he could hide in while his predator gave pursuit. Eventually, the young hunter wound up in front of a massive sandstone monolith standing at the center of the canyon, none other than Spider Rock itself. Of course, the man's first reaction was one of disappointment. He looked up and down the obelisk tower and felt it wouldn't be possible to climb, as he was too exhausted from running and didn't represent the most expert climber of the tribe. All hope seemed lost until at the last second, a cord of silk dropped down in front of the young hunter's eyes, hanging from the apex of Spider Rock. The man couldn't believe it, but grabbed at the silken cord without hesitation. He pulled on it for a second, testing its strength, and found it strong enough to climb. He then wrapped the end of the cord around his waist, tied it in a knot, and used it to mount the monolith. The enemy tribesmen ran into view, and upon seeing the man's ascension, retreated from the chase once and for all. Meanwhile, back on top of Spider Rock, the young hunter finally reached the summit. He released himself from the silken cord and laid down on a flat sheath of sandstone to rest after his heart-thumping endeavor. As if his fortune couldn't get any better, the young hunter was also greeted with abandoned eagle eggs for food and a small puddle of the night's dew for drink. It was almost as if someone, or something, was looking out after the man. It didn't take long for the hunter's guardian angel to reveal herself as none other than Spider-Woman. She said she had witnessed the hunter's chase and knew he'd wander near her roost, spinning a fortified rope of her finest silk to anchor to a rock and drop down to his rescue. The young man couldn't be more thankful,
and told the Spider-Woman tenfold how much he appreciated her saving grace. After he recovered from his close call, he descended Spider Rock on the magical silken cord one more time, before venturing back home through Dead Man's Canyon. Back at the caves of Canyon de Chelly, the hunter shared his experiences to the rest of his Navajo community. He proclaimed to have been saved by Spider-Woman, and Spider Rock would be considered sacred ground henceforth. For generations, those who came after the young hunter would know of the deity's absolute protection over the land and the land's young kin, her spirit and her home, real Navajo legends. For millennia, folks around the world have passed down stories of lost treasure both by land and by sea. Across all corners of the planet, you're bound to happen upon a tale of buried gold, misplaced riches, or disappeared diamonds, no matter who it is you speak to or whatever ledger you pick up and read. Some treasure stories revolve around ancient artifacts detailing the past lives of lost civilizations, resources of newfound knowledge and historical enlightenment. Others revolve around mankind's inherent drive towards wealth and fortune, often coming with lessons on greed, materialism, and the consequences of conquest. Usually, these types of tales take place on the coasts of untamed waters or in unexplored territories of countries far from America, much less the western frontier. However, when taking a closer look at the records and textbooks detailing life in the American West, you'll find there are plenty of similar stories regarding gold, artifacts, and other legendary loot circulating around west of the Mississippi River. Thus, to better grasp the lore surrounding treasure-laden quests from around the frontier, here are two tales of lost treasure originating in the Wild West. Back before the real gold and silver mining booms took hold of the American frontier in the mid-19th century, expedition parties from various countries patrolled the western territories with unbridled optimism that a reward beyond measure awaited their discovery. One such clan of hopeful pioneers was a large French exploratory regime in the last days of the 18th century, consisting of more than 300 men and over 450 horses. These Frenchmen were instructed by then First Consul Napoleon Bonaparte to find gold, silver, or other precious minerals that had been rumored to fill the streams and creek beds of the Rocky Mountains. The men left New Orleans and gathered at the rendezvous point in modern-day Leavenworth, Kansas, which was then considered a small outpost in the heart of the colony of Louisiana. From Leavenworth, the Frenchmen trekked westward into additional Spanish territory, then called the Viceroyalty of New Spain. These regions included the southern half of the Rocky Mountains, where previous French explorers had claimed to have found precious metals and other valuables. Eventually, the expedition made it to the base of the mountains and started to prospect in the general vicinity. Unable to pull together anything of value, the posse pushed forward, this time venturing south towards present-day Summitville, Colorado, just east of the now famous Wolf Creek Pass. It was here the French expedition made their fortune. Within the countless creeks and small rivers flourishing through the area were hefty amounts of gold deposits, undisturbed for what appeared to be centuries. In fact, there was so much gold, records indicate that it would be worth upwards of $33 million in modern times. Unable to transport the unexpected trove back east, the Frenchmen traveled north and hid the gold in 3 secret areas. To make sure they wouldn't forget these remote locations, the party appointed a commanding officer to maintain the map they created for future expeditions. Just as the Frenchmen were preparing to begin their journey home, an unexpected attack by a local warrior tribe of Native Americans descended upon the posse. The 300 or so French soldiers attempted to defend their position, but were quickly outnumbered. As casualties mounted, the commanding officer directed a few of his men to bring the gold out of their 3 hiding spots so that between battles, the treasure could be buried in new locations. The operation was rushed, and while new maps were roughly etched to signal the new hiding points, most of the men involved were slain, including the aforementioned commander. From the initial battlefield, only 20 to 30 Frenchmen were able to escape in one piece. They headed east for another few days and made it as far as the Front Range Mountains, before being attacked again by the same band of warriors. Another 15 to 20 men were killed in battle, and after the Native Americans retreated, only 5 Frenchmen from the original 300 were still alive. These 5 survivors were then met with the harsh oncoming of winter as they shuffled further east back to Leavenworth, Kansas. Another 3 Frenchmen perished as a result of starvation and overall poor health. And the other 2 were able to weather the cold, but only one would return to Leavenworth still breathing. The Frenchman in question was an animated soldier who went by the name LeBlanc. LeBlanc was dead set on returning to Wolf Creek Pass and digging up the discovered gold, but not before returning to France to report his findings to Napoleon. LeBlanc stayed in the Kansas outpost for a few weeks to regain his strength and nutrition before the long journey back across the Atlantic. Once he arrived in France, LeBlanc met personally with the higher-ups of the French government, detailing his trials on America's western frontier and the riches now supposedly buried beneath the Rocky Mountains. The French government was intrigued by LeBlanc's story and requested a map be brought forth so that a follow-up expedition could be had in the coming months. LeBlanc, withholding 2 versions of the same map, gave 1 copy to the French regime and kept 1 for himself. In due time, another expedition force of 50 men was mounted along the western frontier in America. Records don't distinguish the second posse, so it is difficult to tell if it was arranged by the French officials or LeBlanc himself. Nevertheless, the expedition trekked back towards the Summitville, Colorado area where the gold was first found, but not before stopping by an outpost in Taos, New Mexico. Here, they hired a local guide to take them back up towards the treasure's resting spot. Nobody would hear from the 50 Frenchmen again for months, until the guide returned to Taos with news of yet another attack by Native Americans on the French expedition. He declared he was the only survivor, and the treasure remained buried. The rest of Taos wasn't so sure, however. Thinking the posse would return with enough riches to share with the outpost, they saw the guide as a liar and a thief, accusing him of murder and taking all of the lost treasure for himself. The accusations reached the Spanish government, and the guide was tried for murder. Little evidence came forth to convict the guide of killing 50 French soldiers in cold blood, and he was acquitted after a short trial. The Taos locals remained stumped, however, and couldn't figure out how 50 men were killed, while the lone, small-time guide was able to escape. To this day, some believe the expedition was in fact guided by LeBlanc, who found the gold and killed the rest of his men to claim all the fortune for himself, before paying the guide to return to Taos with the fabricated tale of another bloody Native American battle. While the exact fate of LeBlanc remained unknown, the legends of his treasure map persisted, one of which was championed by a man known as William Ewell, who stated he had acquired an exact copy of the original map. William Ewell spent his life searching the entirety of the valleys between Wolf Creek Pass and Saguache, Colorado, but it never amounted to much of anything. From the hands of William Ewell, the map then went to another prospector by the name of Asa Poor. Poor was able to find landmarks in the area represented on the treasure map, but the gold was left undiscovered. After Poor's failed mission, he handed the map to one of his 2 partners, a man by the name of Montroy. Montroy never went back to the Summitville area to retrace his steps, and his version of the treasure map disappeared a few years later. In the years since, the mountain peak just over 100 miles north of the Wolf Creek Pass gold deposits was named Treasure Mountain, as an ode to the lost French gold cache. The mountain and its surrounding foothills and lower valleys are thought to be where the treasure still resides. In the mid-20th century, a family from the Summitville, Colorado area came forward with news that they had found 7 of the 8 natural landmarks mentioned on LeBlanc's original treasure map. The family claimed to be direct descendants of the legendary Frenchmen, and that they had been searching for the lost gold for 3 generations, away from the public's eye. In 1993, a male member of the family discovered a tunnel in the mountains around Wolf Creek Pass while hunting for elk. The tunnel was quickly determined to have been man-made, and the man decided his only choice was to explore the dig site further. After managing to venture about 20 feet deep into the tunnel, the man found further passage blocked with what appeared to be underground landslide remnants. However, just before the blockage, the man discovered a unique carving on the hillside's wall. Using his flashlight to illuminate the shadows, the man realized the wall carving was the 8th and final landmark from LeBlanc's treasure map, the last clue he needed in his family's long gestating search. The following day, the man and 20 other family members dug 12 feet deeper into the tunnel, clearing the blockage and opening up the hillside. The family was ready to celebrate, but first wanted to light the tunnel with an array of candles so that the men could continue digging past dusk. The light never came, though, as the family was met face to face with a large rattlesnake nestling in the tunnel. When they scrambled back outside, another force of nature spooked the party, this time in the form of a colony of bats. The bats swirled around the family, unrelenting in their pursuit. Once the family was able to wave the bats off, they finally attempted to light the candles leading into the tunnel, set with a trap to capture the awaiting rattlesnake. Before they could, they noticed the candle at the very end of the tunnel had lit itself, glowing like the eye of a slumbering mountain beast. At the same time, a great horned owl swooped down from the twilight sky and lashed its talons at the party, the final signal to the family that whatever lay inside of the mountains was protected by something unseen. While the folktale of LeBlanc's descendants is the dominating story in regards to the legend of Treasure Mountain, other accounts believe the gold was discovered by the Ute tribal warriors who first attacked the French expedition in the late 1700s. Today, word around America's southwestern region is that the band of Ute took the gold after the battle ended and buried it near the mouth of the Rio Grande Canyon, just under 300 miles south of Treasure Mountain. The lost outlaw loot of Flagstaff takes us back to central Arizona in the year 1880. Construction of the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad was halted right outside of Canyon Diablo after the supplied railroad bridge pieces were determined to be too short to provide safe passage over the arroyo. With the railroad workers stranded in the Arizona desert, a small rugged community named after the canyon popped up, eventually hosting a diverse crew of hidden outlaws and runaway gamblers. The town itself had no lawmen, despite the quick construction of various saloons, brothels, and gambling houses. This led to an increase of criminal activity, considering the outlaws saw Canyon Diablo as the perfect spot to prey on unsuspecting travelers and transplants from Flagstaff, 35 miles to the west. Nevertheless, stagecoaches transporting passengers and cargo to California used Canyon Diablo as an outpost before heading west to Flagstaff and further on to California country. In 1881, during the heyday of Canyon Diablo's lawless torment, a mail carrier transport traveling from the east stopped in the junction to transfer mail to a westbound stagecoach heading towards Flagstaff. During the transfer, the passengers of the stagecoach stepped outside and watched as 4 large mail sacks were placed on the westbound stagecoach, 2 of them looking heavier than what was considered normal for the average mail sack. After the transfer was complete and the passengers were well fed, the stagecoach trekked north until they reached the California Santa Fe Trail, which would take them to Flagstaff, then to Needles, California, where the next functioning railroad was positioned. The stagecoach didn't get far, however. After traversing difficult elevation and reaching a steady divide atop the San Francisco peaks, the stagecoach was stopped by 5 outlaws, riding atop their horses with guns drawn, pointed directly at the heads and hearts of the innocent passengers. The outlaws, who had more than likely spotted the party and its potential fortune in Canyon Diablo, didn't say as much as a word. Rather, the leader of the gang simply motioned for 2 of his cronies to remove the 2 heavy mail sacks from the stagecoach. Once the bags were placed at the feet of the bandits, the stagecoach was allowed to press forward. At around 5 p.m. local time, the stagecoach and its flustered passengers arrived in Flagstaff. At the time, Flagstaff was a newly settled junction, consisting of only 2 stores, 4 saloons, and a stagecoach station. At the station, an agent and his stagemaster heard of the robbery and were at first perplexed by the theft of 2 plain mail bags by a dastardly band of outlaws. At the station, an agent and his stagemaster heard of the robbery and were at first perplexed by the theft of 2 plain mail bags by a dastardly band of outlaws. When the stagemaster couldn't make sense of it, he did his own investigation and learned that the 2 heavy mail sacks in question were actually large parcels of gold and silver bricks heading to a bank in San Francisco from Albuquerque, New Mexico. The stagemaster then contacted Wells Fargo, who alerted the western locales of an increase in highway robberies and outlaws targeting stagecoaches. For years, Wells Fargo had attempted to camouflage their more precious cargo with plain mail bags carrying 5-gallon whiskey kegs, with the gold and various riches hidden inside. Now, it seemed like the 5 outlaws who had robbed the Canyon Diablo stagecoach had acquired inside information and knew exactly what they were doing when they thefted the mail sacks. Without time on their side, the stagemaster and Wells Fargo teamed up to form a posse of bounty hunters to chase after the bandits and reclaim the gold and silver. To aid their search, Wells Fargo pleaded for the U.S. Army to assist. The United States government ultimately agreed, sending along a band of the 6th U.S. Cavalry to scout whatever trail the outlaws might have left behind on the San Francisco peaks. Unable to establish a trace, they hired 2 Native American scouts to speed up the process. In the end, the Reclamation Party consisted of 12 party members and successfully located the gang of 5 outlaws to modern-day Viet Springs, some 8,500 feet above the ground. Up in the mountains, the bandits had tied up their horses to a pole right outside of a makeshift log cabin. They were actually preparing to leave at the time of the cavalry siege and opened fire on the party before they could hop aboard their saddles. Of course, as ruthless and conniving as the stagecoach bandits were, they were no match for the U.S. cavalrymen. All 5 of the outlaws perished, and the cabin and horses were free to claim by the bounty expedition. Despite the victory, however, the ambush didn't bring the men any closer to the stolen stagecoach loot. Nowhere in the cabin did the party uncover any gold and silver bricks, the treasure now lost to the rocky Arizona wilderness. The news was greeted with optimism by the folks down in Flagstaff, who caught wind of the missing treasure and flocked to Viet Springs in droves. It's said a team of more than 12 men ventured to the abandoned cabin in the coming days, digging up the entire lot, only to find nothing more than the dirt of the earth below them. It didn't take long for the excitement to fizzle out, as Wells Fargo was forced to forget about their losses, and the residents of Flagstaff, Canyon Diablo, and everywhere in between turned heads to the next stagecoach robbery. By 1883, the railroad to Needles, California was completed, and the rugged town of Canyon Diablo was abandoned by the end of the century. Meanwhile, Flagstaff remained a flourishing community and saw major growth at the hands of the Pacific Railroad. Sometimes, its citizens would hear about the lost treasure up in the San Francisco peaks, hidden in a mountain ledge overlooking the city. The man responsible for driving such claims came from George Viet himself, the property owner of the original outlaw hideout. While George had no official ties to the old bandits, he was aware of the loot that they left behind. He spent the rest of his days digging all over the hillsides, around the spring beds, and he even destroyed the log cabin where the shootout took place to search beneath its floorboards. George's excavation also took him to the Lava River cave within the lava tubes, ancient tunnels burrowed out by molten rock from a volcanic eruption 700,000 years ago. These icy caverns weren't discovered until 1915, but were thought to be a popular hideout amongst small-time outlaws in the Wild West's heyday. In the decades since, treasure hunters from around the country have journeyed to the heart of Arizona to search the mountains west of Canyon Diablo and the lava tubes within for the forgotten gold and silver of Flagstaff. To this day, it has yet to be found, like all the treasures lost to the mysteries of the American frontier. As violence, conflict, and bad blood between various foreign nations, Native Americans, and settlers erupted on the western frontier, so did the coordinated battles between each side. Some of the most famous wars and the battles that came between them occurred in the American West, such as the Texas Revolution, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and Red Cloud's War, just to name a few. However, beyond these massive conflicts and battlefields covered in bloodshed were much smaller conflicts that are mostly left out of modern-day textbooks. The truth of the matter was, there were so many miniature wars and unsettled tensions that it would take thousands of pages of text to try and summarize every single conflict that existed on the frontier. Thus, to make sense of these smaller struggles and uncover the fascinating events that led to such chaos, here are two of the lesser-known battles of the Wild West
you probably haven't heard of. The history surrounding the Mason County War, also known as the Hoodoo War, originated long before its violent heyday in 1875. Rather, the story of Mason County's convoluted conflict started on the shores of the Atlantic, where immigrants from all over Europe landed in the United States with the hope to join in on the migration across America's pastures. Beginning in the 1840s, the most prevalent of these immigration pockets were Germans, and many of these Germans ventured west of the Mississippi to stake their claim to the still untamed lands of the frontier. One of the most sought-after regions by migrating German Americans were stretches of Gillespie and Mason counties located in the heart of Texas. These counties were included in the Fisher-Miller Land Grant, a grant sold to a German colonization company in February of 1842. The company believed it was the perfect chance to afford new opportunities to German immigrants seeking a new life. Of course, many of the people involved with Central Texas affairs opposed the land grant, as German Americans did not get a warm welcome from either already established Texans or the Native American tribes still populating the area. The most affected of these immigrants were German ranchers and farmers, constantly dealing with the local cattle rustling bands. The Germans had for years maintained an understanding of mutual respect. They would remain loyal to their new home country, but only if left undisturbed by their neighbors near and far. As the cattle rustling operations increased, so did the ignorance shown by the fellow Texans living in the center of the Lone Star State. When trail bosses and security posses were alerted by Germans of their missing livestock, those in charge would merely shrug their shoulders. These trail bosses would even go as far as to steal the unbranded animals so that they could sell or trade their stolen goods without suspicion from buyers. Most of the trail bosses were hired on good faith that they would return shared profits to any family who allowed their unbranded cattle to go to the market, but they especially double-crossed the German ranchers much more frequently. In 1860, the tensions hit a breaking point when an unnamed tribe of Native Americans swooped through Mason County and killed recently elected Sheriff Thomas Milligan, putting on edge all of the German homesteaders over the next decade. There was also the dominating thought that a lot of the increased disrespect experienced by the German immigrants from their neighbors was due to their support of the Union Army during the U.S. Civil War, while most of Texas had sided with the Confederacy. And yet, serious action wouldn't come underway until 1872, when two men by the names of John Clark and Dan Horster were elected by a German-American community as sheriff and cattle inspector, respectively. Sheriff Clark and Inspector Horster got right to work, assembling a team of stolen cattle hunters, hired investigators to venture around the territory and reclaim lost livestock. After a few years, the operation was able to lock down the whereabouts of the Backus brother gang and 8 other rustlers, and they arrested 5, including 2 Backus brothers. This sent a signal to the rest of Mason and Gillespie counties that the German members of the communities were serious about finally cracking down on crime. Soon, however, the innocent approach to handling criminal affairs transformed into full-stop vigilante justice. After the Backus brother gang and their cronies were thrown in the Mason County jailhouse by Deputy John Worley, a member of the cattle hunting posse named Tom Gamble started a rumor that Sheriff Clark and Inspector Horster wanted the arrested party lynched. The gossip spread like wildfire through the town until a mob of about 40 descended the county jailhouse in the evening hours of February 18, 1875. Deputy Worley refused to hand over the keys, and the mob resorted to a battering ram to open the cell doors and sweep away the prisoners. Nearby, Sheriff Clark was entertaining the likes of visiting Texas Ranger Dan W. Roberts. Neither he nor Inspector Horster had ever ordered a lynch mob, and were both incensed by the idea. When the sheriff and Texas Ranger men were alerted to the situation downtown, they rushed to the jailhouse, only to be told to stay back by armed members of the mob. Clark and Roberts attempted to push through, but ultimately walked back when threatened with a gunshot to the head. Unable to sit by the wayside, Sheriff Clark knew he couldn't let vigilante justice take root in his jurisdiction. Aided by the help of Ranger Roberts, Clark rounded up 6 other Mason County residents to bear arms and attempt to halt the mob's actions. By the time they tracked the horde of angry German ranchers to the south part of town, however, they were already too late.
the mob had hanged both Elijah and Pete Backus, as well as their henchmen Abe Wiggins and Tom Turley, before Clark and Roberts spared the life of Charlie Johnson. The lynching of the Backus brothers would be the first of many conflicts that would eventually formulate the Hoodoo Wars of Mason County, Texas. Hoodoos were another name for vigilante citizens who ambushed imprisoned thieves and unsuspecting small-time bandits under the cloak of darkness. They would strike after midnight when most were asleep and unsuspecting, coating their face with charcoal and black paint to blend in with the shadows of the night. On March 25th of that year, the original gossiper Tom Gamble received word that he was the next target of the vigilante hoodoos. He rounded up a group of men to retaliate, but was stopped by Sheriff Clark, who had gathered 62 German immigrants to come together in peace talks. The two sides argued, but ultimately agreed that the lynchings and jailhouse mobs would end. Of course, the white flags didn't wave for long, as tensions brewed once more in May of that year. Cattle Inspector Horster had recently revoked a 1-year prison bond for Tim Williamson, a very popular American in the community, for stealing a young calf. Williamson was working for Loyal Valley business tycoon Charlie Limburg, who would pay $5 to cattle rustlers for unbranded cattle called Mavericks. Eventually, Williamson was arrested by Deputy Worley, but the two men couldn't even make it off Williamson's ranch before a mob of angry German ranchers caught wind of the situation. A German farmer by the name of Peter Bader took lead in the pack and was first to fire upon the American bandit. Williamson was killed on the spot, and yet Bader and the rest of the hoodoo mob escaped scot-free as a grand jury found them innocent after their May 12th trial. The Williamson execution then spurred the anger and resentment of his adopted son, Scott Cooley. Cooley was a former Texas Ranger turned farmer, and a good friend to the Williamson family after they had taken him in. Cooley's birth parents had been slain by Native Americans, but he was rescued from captivity as a young boy by Tim and his family. Cooley had also served the Texas Rangers under legendary Company D leader Captain Perry. He had retired only a few years prior and had resorted to a ranching life in Maynardville, Texas. Through the summer months of 1875, Cooley traveled down to Mason County to inquire about the death of his adopted father figure. He acted mostly anonymously, interviewing residents and acquiring names for exact details and involved names. On August 10th, Cooley decided that he had all the information he needed, and stalked Sheriff Deputy Worley through town. When Worley was busy digging a well with his assistant, Doc Charlie Harcourt, Cooley walked up to Worley and shot him square in the back of the head. As a prize for his vengeance, Cooley scalped the deputy clean, showcasing the act for all to see and know what was coming from Mason County. Soon after, Cooley rounded up his own gang of vigilantes, including brothers John and Mose Beard, George Gladden, and infamous Old West outlaw Johnny Ringo. Together, the posse terrorized the German residents and killed at least 12 men, all in cold blood. Cooley wasn't finished, however, and was hell-bent on taking the names of other responsible Mason County officials. He and his men set their sights on Peter Bader, the German farmer who had shot Williamson himself. During their recon operation, 2 of Cooley's gang members, Mose Beard and George Gladden, were cut off and ambushed by a German mob consisting of Bader, Inspector Horster, and Sheriff Clark. Beard was shot dead, and Gladden was taken prisoner. In retaliation, Cooley hired Bill Koch to his ragtag team of vigilantes. Together, they successfully enacted revenge on Inspector Horster, who was shot riding past the Mason County barbershop where Cooley and company were staked out at. Bill Koch was then lynched by another German hoodoo mob the next day after letting his guard down in Mason County's bloody streets. It didn't take long after the slayings continued for Texas Governor Richard Koch, unrelated to the aforementioned outlaw, to order large factions of Texas Rangers to Mason and Gillespie counties. These factions were led by Major Jones, who recruited 10 of Scott Cooley's former fieldmates in Company D and 30 of Company A to provide security and law enforcement. Jones also dispatched a team of private detectives to trek through central Texas and locate the whereabouts of a now-wanted Scott Cooley. For 2 weeks, the Rangers scoured the plains for signs of Cooley, but nothing ever came of it. A lawman from Texas by the name of Wilson Hay was assigned with the task of arresting the officials in Mason County who contributed to the bloodshed, and namely Sheriff Clark. Clark was able to resign without incident and escaped, never to be heard from again. The still-wanted Cooley gang member Johnny Ringo was also eventually caught, even after 15 members of Major Jones' security forces stepped out of rank with sympathy for their former fellow ranger, Scott Cooley himself. Nevertheless, enough of the Scott Cooley gang evaded capture to continue barraging Mason County with violence despite the presence of Texas Rangers. Johnny Ringo escaped their imprisonment, and in November of 1875, he and Cooley murdered Peter Bader and his brother Charlie. These would be the last major crimes committed by Cooley and his gang, leading to their ultimate arrest in December of that year. In 1876, Cooley and Ringo escaped with the help of sympathetic lawmen overseeing their imprisonment. Ringo departed for Tombstone, Arizona, where he ruffled feathers with Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday. Scott Cooley, meanwhile, went into hiding in Blanco County. In the summer of 1876, news spread that Scott Cooley had died. However, the cause of death has never been solidified. Some say he died of brain fever, while others claim that he was poisoned by one last German hoodoo during dinner at the Nimitz Hotel in Fredericksburg. As for the rest of Mason County, tensions really didn't settle to pre-war levels until 1877. Various bands of hoodoo vigilantes continued lynching and mobbing jailhousers throughout the summer of 1876, and in January of 1877, the Mason County Courthouse was burned down. Along with it, all of the official records detailing the exact happenings of the Mason County War, making the bloody conflict all but an afterthought of the Wild West's infinite lawlessness. Unlike most family feuds and violent conflict across the West, the Tut-Everett War, also known as the Marion County War, didn't revolve around water rights or sovereignty. Rather, the war was centered around two families who simply couldn't see past the other's political affiliation and their staunch supporters afraid that if their elected official lost their seat, personal favors would go by the wayside. The war began back in 1836, when Marion County was first formed by the Arkansas legislature, the same year that Arkansas was admitted into the Union. The county was first populated by various political supporters, but none more notable than the Everett family, fierce defenders of the Democratic Party. The Everett family originally hailed from rural Kentucky, but sought new opportunities when Arkansas expanded their land dispersal. The Everett clan included the towering John, Sim, Jesse, and Bart Everett, all influential and hard-headed men in the newly formed community. At odds with Marion County's most affluent family was the Tutt family from the neighboring Searcy County. The Tutts were from rural Tennessee themselves, but had moved to Arkansas Territory long before the Everetts and were miffed by the loss of Searcy County land as it was awarded to Marion County instead. Not only that, but the Tutt family members were also very proud Whig Party constituents and worried that the addition of Southern Democrats in their vicinity would ruin the political prowess that they had held over the rest of the county. The Tutts were also fierce gamblers and drinkers. The family patriarch, R.B. Tutt, fathered 3 boys in Ben, David, and Hansford Hamp Tutt, who all helped manage a grocery store and saloon. In between their business duties, however, the men grew fond of horse racing, gambling, and fighting with anyone who stirred up trouble. Thus, when the Everetts marched through Marion County with a loud voice supporting the Democrats, the Whig-loving Tutts could not just stand by and watch peacefully. Sometime between 1844 and 1848, a political debate was hosted in Yellville, Arkansas. The Tutts arrived at the debate site with staunch supporters from Searcy County, who were forced to align with Marion County when county lines were redrawn. The debate quickly morphed into a brawl, and ended with a Tutt family supporter and Whig Party member Alfred Burns gashing an Everett brother's head with a hoe blade. The room emptied out in an instant as everyone believed the Everett brother to be dead. In a twist, however, the brother lived to tell the tale, and the rest of the Everetts saw a storm brewing unlike ever before as the arguments and fistfights carried into the end of the decade. The next major incident came in October of 1848, again involving Sim Everett and the folks of Yellville. This time, instead of fists, a gunfight broke out amongst Democrats and Whigs, with Sim falling injured before succumbing to his gunshot wounds. Knowing they needed to retaliate for a cold-blooded murder, the Everett family targeted not the Tutt family themselves, but rather their strongest supporters in the King family. 2 days later, on October 11th, the Everetts tracked down and killed old William King and his son Loomis. This sparked a series of monthly gunfights between the feuding families, usually amassing only injuries as the families avoided casualties despite the violence. By Independence Day of 1848, the sheriff of Marion County, Jesse Mooney, had seen enough. Ewell Everett had been elected judge, while a fierce Tut supporter named George Adams was named law enforcement constable, and the tensions refused to lessen with public offices now in question. Harkening back to his experiences hunting down outlaws and ending crime spurts, Sheriff Mooney handpicked a posse of lawmen to enforce security in Marion County and prevent any further gunfights. Little to his knowledge, another gunfight in Yellville had started just as Mooney brought his men together to deputize them. Mooney's posse ventured to the saloon where the Tuts had been ambushed by the Everetts, but they got caught in the crossfire as well. By the end of the fight, which saw members of both families throw down their guns and bash each other in with batons and knives, 5 men were found dead. This included Bart Everett on one side and Jack King, Davis, Ben, and Lunsford Tutt on the other. A surviving member of the fight, Dave Sinclair, had long been hunted by the Everetts for initially executing their beloved brother Sim. Dave ran away from Yellville in the aftermath, but was effortlessly tracked down by the remaining Everetts on July 5th and killed without trial. Jesse Everett also finally got word of the bloodshed his family saw since his retreat to Texas just a few years prior. Full of wrath, Jesse promised vengeance against the Tutt family and returned to Arkansas to carry out his plan. Meanwhile, Sheriff Mooney continued his efforts to stop the violence and dispatched his eldest son, Thomas, to travel to Little Rock and plead for help from Governor Thomas Drew. Unfortunately, after his visit with the governor, Thomas never returned home and disappeared without a trace. A search party was sent out to locate the boy, but all they found was the carcass of his horse. To this day, Thomas Mooney's vanishing remains a cold case. However, it has long been suspected that one of the 2 feuding families had something to do with it. Regardless, Governor Drew went by his word and brought relief to the northern Arkansas region. He sent a militia to Carroll County, where various supporters of the Everett family were arrested. Yet after their 6 weeks in Carroll County ended, the militia left town only for the surviving Everett family members to break the arrested men out of jail. In the last major act of the Tutt-Everett War, one of the highest-ranking members of the Everett family hired a mysterious gunfighter by the name of the Dutchman. The Dutchman, argued to be both a bounty hunter and a regular old stranger, hailed from Texas, but his true identity was never discovered. Nevertheless, the Dutchman proved his worth when he tiptoed to the banks of Crooked Creek and shot the top member of the Tutt family, Hansford Hamp Tutt. Afterwards, he alerted the Everetts of his successful mission and left Arkansas never to be seen again. With the loss of their leader, the Tutt family quickly dissolved their presence in Marion County. At the same time, the Everett family suffered additional losses with a sweeping cholera epidemic in 1849 and 1850, and the Tutt-Everett War that dominated the latter half of the decade ended in a whisper. Ultimately, the Marion County War was one of the only major family feuds to occur in the state of Arkansas. Yet, like the more famous family conflicts of history, such as the Hatfields and McCoys, the Tutt-Everett War symbolizes a time period in America we will most likely never see again, where even the smallest of disagreements ballooned into the bloodiest of battles, lost in time to the overall lawlessness that plagued the western frontier. One of the most prominent aspects to life on the American frontier was the ominous atmosphere of lawlessness that followed folks across the Mississippi River and into the territories of the Wild West. While there was an undeniable presence of the U.S. government in many large establishments dotted throughout the frontier, such as army forts and major trading centers, smaller settlements weren't as fortunate. This allowed for homesteaders and communities all across the western United States to feel vulnerable as bandits and criminals scoured the lowest of valleys and highest of hillsides to take advantage of the unprotected and make a living in a world where winners take all. Some of these infamous outlaws included the likes of Jesse James and Billy the Kid, popular figures of the Wild West's heyday that staked their claim to fame via ruthless train robberies, invigorating gunfights, and more often than not, cold-blooded murder in the name of glory and riches. However, the western frontier was too massive for only a few fabled criminals to take all of the gold and greatness for themselves. Alongside the major players were hundreds of smaller bandits, sometimes individuals who had once teamed up with the larger-than-life names, only to leave the posses
and make a go of it by their lonesome. To understand their role on the American frontier and get a better picture into the lives of the gunfighters we rarely speak of, here are two lesser-known outlaws of the Wild West, with fascinating backstories in their own right. Most bandits and thieves dotting the Wild West with a trail of crimes spent their entire lives devoted to the vices, known only for their evil doings and foul play. Our first outlaw, however, was a con man both in trade and in his legacy. Mysterious Dave Mather masks his devious intentions with half a life spent working for the law, only adding to the intrigue behind the man who couldn't be read. David Allen Mather was born on August 10, 1851, in Saybrook, Connecticut, to parents Ulysses W. Mather and Lydia Wright. Ulysses was a ship captain on the Atlantic seas, best compared to Ishmael from Herman Melville's Moby Dick, published that very year. He came from a lineage of Massachusetts sailors and English seafarers of the seven seas before them. In 1856, Ulysses left his family unannounced to focus on his sailing career and to become a true lawman of the Atlantic. He would sever all contact from the rest of the Mather clan until his death on September 13, 1864, when he was murdered in Shanghai, China, whilst aboard his personal vessel. Ulysses' eldest son, Dave, never forgave his father for his abandonment and pain he administered on the family, and began to forge his own legacy. As he aged, he would tell folks he was actually the descendant of Cotton Mather, a famous writer and clergyman from the New England region. By the time Mather was 10 years old, his mother had also died, and he was now under the care of his grandfather, who looked after both he and his two brothers, Josiah Wright and George Conway. Dave attended public school, but was never much of a student, and passed up a secondary education as it was too expensive and his marks were too low. Instead, Dave became a laborer at the age of 19. In 1870, he and his brother Josiah joined a cargo ship crew in Clinton, Connecticut, before trekking all the way to New Orleans, Louisiana, to start a new life. For 2 years, Dave Mather seemingly disappeared. His tracks halted in the Deep South before re-emerging in 1872, in the iconic Wild West frontier town, Dodge City, Kansas. It was in Dodge City that Dave started testing the waters of life on the western frontier, teaming up with his brother Josiah once more to become buffalo hunters across the Great Plains. He would also make connections with cattle rustlers in 1873, whom he joined on occasion in Sharp County, Arkansas. When Dave wasn't learning the various trades of outlaw life in the Wild West, he was frequenting saloons and gambling houses across the frontier, despite not being much of a gambler himself. His most popular hangout joint was a saloon in Denver, Colorado, where it was said that he could be found watching men lose fortunes at the blackjack and poker tables. He always packed 2 twin Colt revolvers under his top coat, deep in thought as his dark eyes peered around whatever room he occupied. It was this piercing glare and lack of spoken words that eventually branded the outlaw with the name Mysterious Dave, his square yet short stature and big bushy mustache completing the look of a man seemingly always in the shadows. As he aged further into adulthood, Mysterious Dave found a thrill in petty cons and get-rich-quick schemes, teaming up with the legendary gunfighter and future lawman himself, Wyatt Earp. At the time, in 1878, Earp was stationed in Mobeetie, Texas, busy selling gold brick fakes to gullible tradesmen whilst on a mission to track down another Texan outlaw. Mysterious Dave saw it as an opportunity to learn from an aspiring lawman, as his dreams of working for the law became clearer and clearer by the day. Later that year, Mysterious Dave continued to rise to the top of law enforcement ranks when he moved to East Las Vegas of the New Mexico Territory and became employed as a U.S. Deputy Marshal. Of course, despite the title, Mysterious Dave couldn't completely ignore his true calling as a con man. He quickly teamed up with Dutch Henry Bourne, one of the most notorious horse thieves in American history. Together, the men carried out a couple of successful horse rustling operations until they were arrested along the Texas Panhandle. After being released, Mysterious Dave was arraigned once more in October of 1879 for a train robbery, but was acquitted before rejoining the East Las Vegas police posse. The real legacy of Mysterious Dave wouldn't take off until January of 1880. On the 22nd of that month, Mysterious Dave was on post as assistant deputy, working with Marshal Joe Carson in East Las Vegas.
The men were originally alerted to make their way to the Close and Patterson Variety Hall on Main Street, as 4 men had refused to check their guns upon entry. The 4 men, named T.J. House, James West, John Dorsey, and William Randall, were disgruntled by the request, and grew even angrier when the lawmen were dispatched on their behalf. Thus, a classic Wild West gunfight soon broke out, and bloodshed was had on the steps of the Close and Patterson saloon. Marshal Carson was killed instantly, but Mysterious Dave held his ground, single-handedly killing William Randall and disabling James West. John Dorsey was also hit, but managed to escape with the help of T.J. House. With the death of Carson, Mysterious Dave retained the role of Marshal of East Las Vegas, New Mexico, and it didn't take long for him to impose a new rule over the town. 3 days after the Close and Patterson gunfight, Mysterious Dave arrived at the workplace of Joseph Costello, where Costello had drawn a weapon on his employees after a heated argument erupted from nowhere. Mysterious Dave's presence unfortunately made matters only worse, as Costello was untrustworthy of the new marshal and a bit suspicious in general. When Costello barked at the marshal to stand back or he'd shoot him dead, Mysterious Dave was said to have pulled out his own Colt in a quick draw and fired just one deadly shot at Costello before the estranged businessman could even get his finger back on the trigger. The reign of Marshal Dave Mather was short-lived in East Las Vegas from then on. In February of 1880, just 2 weeks after the Close and Patterson shootout, the surviving gang members of T.J. House and John Dorsey were located at the residence of Juan Antonio Dominguez in Buena Vista, New Mexico. Mysterious Dave called on his old friend, Dirty Dave Rudabaugh, fellow gunfighter J.J. Webb, and an assortment of other lawmen to ride 30 miles north to Buena Vista and bring the 2 criminals back to East Las Vegas to stand trial. When the Dominguez home was surrounded, House and Dorsey agreed to peacefully return to East Las Vegas only if Marshal Dave Mather would promise their safety from irate citizens who sought revenge for the cold-blooded murder of their original marshal. Mysterious Dave agreed to the terms, but could never hold up his end of the bargain. Just hours after House and Dorsey were imprisoned at the San Miguel County Jail, a lynch mob broke the 2 men out and took them to the windmill at the Central Plaza to hang them for their misdeeds. In a twist, the men's lives ended up being spared after the widow of Marshal Carson fired shots into the lynch mob. But Mysterious Dave's reputation never recovered. After a series of murders and whispers of Dave's connections to a local crime syndicate spread around town, the mysterious lawman turned conman resigned in March of 1880. For the next few years, Mysterious Dave spent his days as a drifter around various parts of Texas. He attempted to get in on the brothel industry, but instead spent time in and out of jail for counterfeiting and petty thefts, such as stealing silk and diamonds from his former business partner, Georgia Morgan. Despite his growing criminal history, Mysterious Dave always seemed to be back on the side of the law in the end. On June 1, 1883, he was employed as the assistant city marshal in Dodge City, Kansas, where he first earned his keep as a lesser-known outlaw. At this point in the town's history, the vices of gambling, prostitution, and dance halls in general were unlawful for official businesses to incorporate. Thus, it came as a surprise when Mysterious Dave attempted to turn his recently purchased business of the Opera House Saloon into a dance hall, only for City Council to reject the plan. Yet in a gut punch of a twist, the City Council did not reject the same plan for another saloon owner, controlled by the likes of Thomas Nixon. Nixon's saloon was on the outskirts of Dodge City, and in a remote enough area to justify the dance hall's legality. Of course, Mysterious Dave saw this as a direct attack on him, as he had also been replaced as assistant city marshal after just 9 months on the job by none other than Thomas Nixon himself. After running a few nonviolent trials to get back at his newfound rival, such as a beer price war, Mysterious Dave took to lawlessness to get back at Nixon. On July 18, 1884, Mysterious Dave shot Thomas Nixon during a heated confrontation, wounding the assistant marshal before being apprehended by fellow Dodge City lawmen. After posting bond from the attempted murder charge, Mysterious Dave decided Nixon must be dealt with permanently. 3 days later, on July 21st, the gunman approached Nixon without muttering as much as a single word and fired 4 shots into the unsuspecting back of Thomas Nixon. The assistant marshal died instantly. Despite an arrest and official trial, jurors found Mysterious Dave Mather not guilty on the wanted murder charge of Thomas Nixon. They believed the argument that Nixon was actually the instigator in the affairs between the two men, and truly felt the execution was justified. Thus, Mysterious Dave was a free man once more. Over the next decade, Mysterious Dave Mather's presence on the western frontier slowly dissipated. In 1885, he was arrested for the murder of another man, this time a gambler by the name of David Barnes. He was arraigned with his brother, Josiah Wright, but the men were eventually able to post bonds and escape town after being threatened by then-Marshal Bill Twyman. After departing Dodge City for the final time, Mysterious Dave ventured through the Great Plains, serving temporary positions as city marshal for small municipalities in Nebraska and Kansas. His last official posting came in New Kiowa, Kansas, where he fled in September of 1885. In November of 1887, the bondsman who had granted Mysterious Dave his bail money for the killing of David Barnes attempted to locate the former lawman for the renewed trial in the Barnes case. When he couldn't find a trace, the bondsman declared Mysterious Dave dead, despite never having a body to prove it. Nevertheless, the trial judge affirmed the declaration, and Dave Mather was no longer a wanted man in Dodge City, Kansas. Where Mysterious Dave ended up after his trouble in New Kiowa drove him further west isn't confirmed, but many believe that he traveled to San Francisco, California, where he took a boat up to Vancouver and joined the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Force. These accounts state that the conman continued his crimes north of the US border, where he looted a job site he was instructed to guard for up to £20,000, but was able to continue serving all the way until 1922. The RCMP has since stated they have no such record of this occurring. Other stories place Mysterious Dave east of the Mississippi River, where he lived cooped up in the mountains of Tennessee before being murdered by a gang of moonshiners. Not even his closest friend and brother, Josiah Wright, ever learned of Mysterious Dave's official fate, but he was as certain as anybody that whatever happened to the lawman turned outlaw, it was emblematic of the do-or-die lifestyle he had spearheaded for nearly his entire life. On April 11, 1835, Tiburcio Vasquez was born to parents Jose Vasquez and Maria Cantua in Monterey, Alta California, Mexico, which constitutes present-day California of the United States. The Vasquez family came from a long line of California transplants, as Tiburcio's great-grandfather was one of the original settlers of the De Anza expedition in 1776. It was led by Juan Bautista de Anza, a founding father of Spanish California and major leader of the Spanish Empire. With their prominent heritage, the Vasquez family had enough money to send Tiburcio to school as a young boy, where he learned to speak both Spanish and English fluently. He never had quite the growth spurt seen by his classmates, however, as by the time he was of age, he only stood around 5'7". Of course, that didn't stop the future bandit from forging a life of intimidation and dominance anyway. At the age of just 17, Tiburcio found inspiration from his older cousin named Anastasio Garcia, one of the most infamous bandits in all of newly admitted California. Garcia took his younger cousin under his wing, showing him the boldness and bravado needed to be bandits along the western frontier. In 1854, Garcia brought Tiburcio to a local dance competition, where a fight between white settlers and Californios broke out. Garcia ended up as part of the conflict, eventually killing Monterey Constable William Hardmount. Tiburcio fled into the nearby hills with his cousin, already a wanted man by US government officials. It was here that Tiburcio decided to devote his life to being an outlaw, later saying that his crimes were acts of vigilante justice against white Americans for their poor treatment towards Mexican Americans and other Hispanic California settlers. These sentiments would be the driving force behind the Roach-Belcher feud that terrorized the folks of Monterey County for 20 years, with both Tiburcio and Garcia playing vital roles in the conflict. Meanwhile, in 1856, Tiburcio was wrestling horses up and down California until he was captured and arrested near Newhall, which is present-day Santa Clarita, California. It was around this time Tiburcio took control of the inmates at the San Quentin prison just north of San Francisco. During his 5-year imprisonment for horse theft, the bandito organized 4 separate prison breaks which saw almost 20 fellow prisoners meet their demise, including one in 1859 in which Tiburcio escaped, only to be sent back after another short stint rustling cattle. After his release in 1863, Tiburcio didn't venture far from Northern California, as he started a highway robbery gang in Sonoma County. In 1866, he was arrested once more in Petaluma for his crimes, this time serving a 3-year sentence. By 1870, Tiburcio had already formed yet another gang of his own, this time featuring other notorious bandidos such as Prosopio Bustamante and Juan Soto. The same year, Tiburcio was nearly killed in a gunfight with a Santa Cruz lawman by the name of Robert Liddell, but the outlaw was able to survive thanks to the efforts of his sisters. Tiburcio and his gang claimed nationwide infamy in 1873 after robbing Snyder's store in San Benito County for over $2,000 and killing 3 civilians in the process. The California governor of the time, Newton Booth, sent various law enforcement teams after the bandidos, putting a $1,000 reward on Tiburcio's capture, dead or alive. To cool off from the nationwide manhunt, Tiburcio fled south to various regions across Southern California, where he wasn't nearly as recognizable as he was up north. Here, he trekked across mountains through Kern County and the deserts of Antelope Valley. Along his journey, Tiburcio would rest at ranches on Elizabeth Lake and hide out within the rocks of Little Rock Creek, both in Southern California. This is where Tiburcio's brother Francisco called home, and Tiburcio was able to blend right back in with his Hispanic community. Mexican Americans residing in the vicinity were actually very fond of Tiburcio, despite his lengthy crimes. They saw him as the man he pretended to be amidst family and friends, an intelligent, handsome young man who could dance, play guitar, and write poetry. Even with the US government still keen on bringing Tiburcio to justice, the bandidos still returned to Northern California in late 1873. In a span of 45 days, the gang raided the Jones General Store in Fresno County before hitting the former town of Kingston. Overall, they stole nearly $3,000 in cash and precious stones, their nonchalant violence and unrest bumping up the bounty reward on Tiburcio to $15,000. The next 6 months or so saw the greatest crime spree ever perpetrated by the now mightily feared Vasquez gang. They raided stagecoach stations near Bakersfield at Robber's Roost, near the silver mines at Owens Lake, and another one at the Soledad Canyon. Some of the robberies included brutal killings of anyone and everyone who attempted to challenge Tiburcio or his men. His favorite method of disposal was leaving a man face down in the desert dust, hands bound behind their back like hogs tied up for slaughter, left for dead in the sun-soaked and barren wastelands. To lay low from the increased bounty posses and government officials, the Vasquez gang returned to the Vasquez Rocks in Los Angeles County. The location allowed Tiburcio and company to hide in a maze of rock formations, while someone stayed as lookout on the tallest point, a rock estimated 150 feet high off the ground. Ultimately, it would be Tiburcio's unrelenting charm and furious obsession with courting women that would bring forth his downfall. One of the side effects of Tiburcio's love of dancing, romance, and poetry was involving himself with women that he had no business interacting with. This usually included married women and young ladies related to his friends or business associates. One such maligned love affair came in the springtime of 1874. Tiburcio was on the run like usual, but found refuge at the home of Greek George Carlambo in Rancho La Brea. This is about the location of present-day West Hollywood in Los Angeles, California. While stationed at Greek George's adobe-built residence, Tiburcio slept with the former camel driver's niece, impregnating her with a child. Greek George's wife and extended family were incensed by the pregnancy, and behind the Vasquez gang's back, turned him over to the Los Angeles County Sheriff, William R. Rowland. During his 9-day stay in the Los Angeles County Jail, he gave 2 interviews to the San Francisco Chronicle and Los Angeles Star newspapers, where he proclaimed that he had never killed a single person and simply wanted to return California to Mexico's rule. Later in May, Tiburcio was transferred by steamship back up north, where he'd stand trial in San Jose, California. To pay for his legal defense, the former bandido signed autographs and sold photos to jailhouse visitors, many of whom were women. In the end, Tiburcio's incessant claims that he was innocent of murder across his life did not hold up in court, and he was sentenced to death after being found guilty for murder during the infamous Tres Pinos robbery. After one last attempt to file for clemency with the state, Governor Pacheco denied the appeal, and Tiburcio was executed at the age of 39 on March 19, 1875. To this day, the legacy of Tiburcio Vasquez is debated by many. Some still claim that the California Bandito was a vital figure in bringing the rights back to Mexican Americans, while others are adamant that he was nothing more than an outlaw masquerading as a revolutionary figure, attempting to retain his image. Regardless of which side you believe to be true, one thing remains certain. Tiburcio and the rest of the Vasquez gang were pure symbols of the Wild West's lawlessness, and a lesson in how savvy and impactful even the lesser-known outlaws were across all of the American frontier. When you close your eyes and picture the mysteries and mythology of the American frontier, the image of a headless horseman more than likely never crosses the horizon, despite its prevalence and storytelling across the world. Yet, the legend of a headless horseman dates back to the Middle Ages of global history, saturating European folklore and oral traditions for centuries. In Ireland, it was the myth of the Dullahan, a dark man, or a horse-riding demonic fairy known to prop his own head under his arm and crack a whip made of human skeleton spine at his victims. In Scotland, it was the myth of a former soldier named Ewan, a decapitated horseman who lost his ability to rise to the rank of chieftain after losing his head in a battle on the Isle of Mull, haunting the region as an act of revenge. In America, it was the myth of the headless Hessian of the Hollow, the ghost of a slain Hessian trooper during the Battle of the White Plains in October of 1776. This legend was then popularized by Washington Irving's 1819 short tale, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, in which the headless horseman utilizes a jack-o'-lantern as a substitute head and weapon of choice, whilst haunting his victims, most notably that of Ichabod Crane. While the legend of Sleepy Hollow grabbed the attention of many across the Atlantic region of a young United States, it never quite chilled the spines of the folks who migrated west of the Mississippi River, at least enough to fill the minds of folks with the fear of a lurking headless horse rider. That is until 1850, when a couple of Texas Rangers returned to their families with the tales of a decapitated outlaw tormenting the barren regions of present-day South Texas, all thanks to a plan of vengeance gone sideways. This is a deeper dive into the folktale of El Muerto, the headless horseman of the Wild West still spotted along the dusty deserts for the last 170 years. The legend of El Muerto's roots go back to 1821, at the conclusion of the Mexican War of Independence. The conflict's resolution saw Spain relinquish North American land that is now present-day Mexico and parts of present-day Texas. The newly acquired lands of Mexico, however, did not bring in the population numbers the Mexican government had hoped for. Rather, the land remained unsettled as the land's first occupiers, mostly bands of Comanche Native Americans, pestered any pioneers that attempted to homestead after Mexico's independence. In an attempt to thwart the threat of the Comanche, Mexico offered free plots of land to United States settlers. The thought was that an influx of white homesteaders would dissuade the Comanche from further raids, and make a newly founded Mexico a promising place to live. Unfortunately for Mexico, the experiment was quickly deemed a failure as the Comanche raids continued and the settlers' relative isolation was exposed. Coming to the aid of the settlers in both Mexico-claimed land and the U.S.-controlled swaths of present-day Texas was Stephen F. Austin, popularly referred to as the Father of Texas across history. In 1823, Austin wanted to protect a recent homesteading party of about 600 to 700 families who had recently migrated to Mexican Texas. Thus, he hired a 10-man security force to watch over the settlers in the area, one of the earliest iterations of the now infamous Texas Rangers. 7 years later, tensions only continued to mount, this time between the Mexican and the United States government. In 1830, Mexican President Bustamante made it unlawful for citizens of the United States to immigrate to Mexico. The U.S. citizens who had already moved to their southern neighbors' territory were incensed, and thus the tensions between the United States and Mexico truly inflamed. In 1835, the Texas Rangers were officially adopted as law enforcement, and quickly grew to triple-digit numbers. By 1836, the Republic of Texas declared its independence from Mexico after the Texas Revolution, but Mexico wouldn't officially acknowledge it. Instead, the Rangers and people of Texas were left to fight against the surrounding indigenous tribes themselves, and the prowess of the organization continued. Violence was most prevalent between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River, once declared no man's land, as the Mexican government had ignored the United States' suggested border and vice versa. These international tensions eventually boiled over into the Mexican-American War after the annexation of Texas in 1846, and by 1848, the conflict ended without the two sides meeting an amicable conclusion. As a result, the Mexican folks still residing in South Texas were abandoned of support or volition, but had nowhere else to go other than staying put in the newly formed Lone Star State, stuck in the drudge of a region known for its crime and conflict. The now flourishing Rangers saw this as an opportunity to impose fear tactics across Texas, especially targeting the leftover Mexican population to the south. This included lynching Mexican thieves and delivering torturous punishment, even against petty criminals. Of these criminals was a horse rustler by the name of Vidal. Vidal was the pseudonym for a former Mexican commander named Lieutenant Juavis. The lieutenant had been captured during the Siege of Bexar in December of 1835 by a soldier by the name of Bate Berry. Berry was a notorious scalper in the West, and to avoid certain death, the lieutenant shared detailed Mexican military strategy to Berry as a trade-off for his release. Eventually, Berry let the lieutenant go, but the former prisoner of war couldn't return to his home country. Instead, he enacted a plan to distress the Americans from that day forth, changing his name to Vidal and hiring a team of thieves to rustle cattle and colts across Texas for the next decade plus. One evening in 1850, Vidal stalked a small settlement along the San Antonio River in the No Man's Land territory in South Texas. The Texas Rangers residing in the community had shipped up northbound to fight off a band of Comanche that had raided another smaller settlement, and the horse rustler knew it was prime time to strike gold. At the time, Vidal was operating under great risk. He already had a hefty bounty attached to his namesake, as well as the infamous wanted dead or alive tag plastered on billboards across the Lone Star State. Nevertheless, Vidal pressed on with his thievery. He and his small team of hired cronies rounded up 10 or more horses from various stables around the settlement. The plan was to nab them clean and quick, as they had planned on a rendezvous in Mexico just to the southwest, heading there after the heist. The next morning, a man by the name of Creed Taylor awoke to find a few of his horses missing from their corral. Unfortunately for Vidal and his band of thieves, these were no ordinary equines, and Creed Taylor was no ordinary man. Rather, the horse rustlers had stolen multiple Mustangs of the most treasured breeds in all of the West from one of the most notorious and skilled Texas Rangers in all of Texas, and a friend to Vidal's former captor and infamous scalper, Bate Berry. Creed Taylor was also a lifelong Texas resident, known for his exploits in the Texas Revolution at just 15 years old, and various accomplishments during the Mexican-American embattlements. In 1841, he joined the Texas Rangers as his days as a soldier were over, until 1864, when he enlisted in the Confederate Army during the U.S. Civil War. In between his fighting days, Creed served the Texas Rangers in all facets of the organization, most notably as a fighting strategist and tracker along the Mexican-American border. It just so happened that on this occasion in 1850, Creed had stayed behind on his West San Antonio ranch rather than joining his fellow Rangers on their Comanche attack up north. Despite living deep within no man's land by the headspring of the Nueces River, Creed didn't fear the bandits lurking in the shadows of the region, knowing he had the acumen to track down anyone who violated his property and protect his livestock. Thus, when Creed realized he had been hit, he wasted no time acquiring the help of a fellow Texas Ranger, another security stalwart by the name of William Alexander Anderson Bigfoot Wallace. Bigfoot Wallace, much like Creed Taylor, was a decorated war hero who fought alongside other soldiers during the Texas Revolution and Mexican-American Wars. He would later become somewhat of a folk hero himself, due to his impeccable tale-telling and grandiose, muscled stature, but not before joining the Rangers to fight against bandits and the Comanche tribes in the 1840s and the 1860s. It's why Creed entrusted the larger-than-life figure of South Texas lore. He knew he needed additional muscle if he was to track down the thieves who stole his precious Mustangs. The deadly duo, along with an additional hired ranch owner by the name of Flores, departed present-day Uvalde on horseback. Creed and Bigfoot Wallace were both highly experienced trackers from their time in the Army and as Rangers, and quickly picked up on the trail of Vidal and his henchmen. As Creed, Bigfoot Wallace, and Flores tiptoed through the violent, saturated wastelands of South Texas, Vidal and company took their time approaching the Mexico border, unaware that anyone would be following them as closely as the Ranger party was. A few days later, Creed and his 2 men arrived at an outlaw camp hidden away in the desert. The trio waited until dusk before moving in on the unsuspecting thieves and finally enacting their plot of revenge. It didn't take long for the three hunters to kill all of Vidal's henchmen, but they weren't satisfied with just another simple murder for the main horse rustler himself. Rather, they wanted to make a statement to all the other thieves who had happened upon the campsite covered with bloodshed. Thus, Creed instructed Bigfoot Wallace to aid him in Vidal's beheading. The two men severed the thief's head, placed it in a sombrero, and tied it to the saddle secured on his wild bronco, so that it would dangle like a Christmas tree ornament. Finally, the Rangers tied the still intact portion of Vidal's corpse to the horse so that it wouldn't fall free, hands roped to the pommel, before whipping the Mustang away from the camp. The wild colt rode into the midnight sky with its headless horseman still perched up like a living being, now a symbol of the treacherous violence committed by thieves and rangers alike in the Wild West. Seeing the act of vengeance completed, Creed, Bigfoot Wallace, and Flores returned to their ranches with all of their cattle and equines returned. Years later, Creed Taylor would tell his story to J. Warren Hunter, who would publish the account in an 1898 manuscript titled The Life of Creed Taylor. Yet, the legend of the South Texas Headless Horseman had already grown exponentially in the years since. In the days following Vidal's grisly murder and the departure of the responsible rangers, folks from across the region, both homesteaders and bandits alike, reportedly saw a wild Mustang galloping across the hillsides of Texas with the headless rider sitting atop the saddle. Some of the first accounts declare the headless horseman wasn't alone, but rather pursued by other teams of outlaws or small tribes of curious Comanche warriors. One of the more far-fetched yet popular claims was that the ghost of Vidal was now in control of the corpse still riding his former chosen bronco, guiding the brave drifters who had followed him to a secret promised land filled with the gold and riches Vidal had acquired after years of rustling cattle and horses. Another haunting legend spoke of the Headless Horseman's terror across South Texas. Many believed a beheaded Vidal and his horse were possessed by the slain thief's disgruntled spirit, and that he had returned to the desert not to lead lucky bystanders to gold, but rather find the men who had tortured him up until his last breath as a form of vengeance. Because the demographics in the region at the time of Vidal's death were predominantly Hispanic, the Headless Horseman of Texas was immortalized as El Muerto, translated to the Dead One in English. In reality, the legend of El Muerto being chased across the open deserts of South Texas are a bit exaggerated. Most onlookers who were unlucky enough to see the sombrero-clad severed head bobbing along the side of the Mustang's gallop were too afraid to approach the phenomena. For the bandits and cowboys and Comanche riders who did get close enough to the Mustang, they figured whatever cargo the horse contained was too great a risk to allow for further passage across the territory, and often shot at the headless rider with either bullets and gunpowder or a barrage of arrowheads. Despite the retaliation, the wild bronco that carried its malign burden aboard the saddle never fell victim to the fearful onslaught, and continued to run free through the wilderness of no man's land. This is when the region once avoided for its outlaws and violence became avoided due to its bad luck and rumored misfortune. It was said that if one ventured through no man's land alone and spotted El Muerto, they would be subjected to evil doings and horrible luck for the rest of eternity. It actually started temporarily solving the high rates of vigilante justice and never-ending crime sprees, purely because of the gossip around the Lone Star State that a haunted boogeyman was let loose in the barren hillsides. After a couple weeks of nightmarish stories passing around the southern part of Texas, the Headless Horseman and his equine were wrangled and held captive by a small crew of ranchers. The farmhands spotted the rider near a watering hole, right next to the settlement south of Collins, Texas, which is now present-day Bend, Bolt, and Alice, Texas, respectively. They quickly realized the horse was exhausted and its companion was no longer alive, and decided to capture them both. When they pulled the headless corpse of Vidal down from the saddle, they found the now shriveled body littered with arrows from the Comanche and bullet holes from the cowboys. Nowhere on the corpse did they find treasures the legend had led them to believe would be there, nor was there anything ominous outside of the horrors of stumbling upon weeks-old remains, which wasn't even necessarily that strange of an occurrence in the Wild West. The Rangers ultimately decided to bury the body of Vidal in an unmarked grave somewhere in the vicinity of Bend, Bolt, while allowing the wild Mustang to run free across South Texas once more, this time sans a passenger well past its demise. For the ranchers and fellow Texans around the Lone Star State, their guards were dropped as many believed the dark days of El Muerto's reign were over, if they were ever that dangerous to begin with. However, it didn't take long for the trepidation to return, as the legend of El Muerto was only just beginning. As soon as Vidal's body was covered with the last speck of soil, the U.S. Army soldiers stationed at Fort Inge, near present-day Uvalde, Texas, started seeing the Headless Horseman riding through the deserted hills once more. They weren't the only ones either. As travel through no man's land opened up to new ranchers and homesteaders, many families reported seeing El Muerto glide across their land at dusk, as if warning the property owners of the dangers that lurked ahead. Sometimes, the folktale spooked potential ranchers from settling in the first place, packing up and departing South Texas as quickly as they had arrived. By 1898, the rest of the United States had heard of the legend of El Muerto through J. Warren Hunter's aforementioned manuscript, in which he sat down with Creed Taylor himself to tell of his life's craziest encounters during his misadventures in the Wild West's heyday. It's unknown how much of Creed's original tale was true, but the account certainly ran through the windmill of Western folktales and urban legends. It's said that the original story actually took place in 1848, in which Bigfoot Wallace and another Texas Ranger by the name of John McPeters were the only ones who trekked through the South Texas desert, chasing after the band of horse thieves. It's said that when they killed the posse, they used the ringleader as a beheading experiment to scare off other rustlers in the vicinity. Creed Taylor only appears as the narrator in this rendition, and wasn't the victim of any horse thefts himself. Those details would be added by J. Warren Hunter's son, J. Marvin Hunter, who rewrote the second edition that had been written by James T. DeShields. DeShields took his turn after Mayne Reid included a dramatized adaptation in her Western novel, The Headless Horseman. J. Marvin Hunter was the one who included Creed Taylor in the actual manhunt. He also decided Vidal's crimes should have a more personal connection with the tale at large, making his former military captors' colts the ones to be stolen, along with removing the character of John McPeters entirely. A famous folklorist by the name of J. Frank Dobie tried his hand at adapting the story in 1928, being the first to suggest El Muerto was actually a former guard at the mines near Candelaria Mission. This could explain why so many early settlers thought that the Headless Horseman might have withheld gold. Dobie's version might have also been influenced by the renowned 1917 sighting of El Muerto, right outside of San Diego, Texas. A young couple migrating to South Texas set up camp one evening, and while sitting by the fire, saw a headless rider atop a massive gray stallion. The rider was screaming at the top of his lungs, "It's all mine, it's all mine." What El Muerto could have been referring to is impossible to say, but if he truly had riches stashed away somewhere in the Texan hillsides, that could have been why. It would be over 50 years until the next major sighting of El Muerto came, when an anonymous person living near Freer, Texas, reported to the authorities a headless horseman galloping around the countryside in 1969. When law enforcement searched the area, however, nothing of note was discovered. While the legends have changed over time, and the true story of two Texas Rangers who beheaded a horse rustler has become the likes of a ghostly folktale, the myths hold strong in the minds and souls of South Texas residents. If you spare them a moment, they will most likely tell you that despite the decades in between Vidal's execution and the creation of El Muerto, the sightings have not wavered off. They'll most likely tell you of the clear, star-filled skies blanketing the hillsides of South Texas in the thick of night, a glossy moonlight providing shadows in an otherwise mischievous darkness, where a headless horseman of the Wild West is said to be seen galloping at breakneck speeds, a symbolic warning to souls both of the past and the present to be wary of the dangers that lie ahead and the dangers in the hearts of the evil folk. They'll most likely tell you of El Muerto. Before colonization took a hold across the North American territories in the 15th century AD, various tribal civilizations existed across the beautiful continental landscape, from the swamps in the south, to the woodland hills in the east, to the plains in the Midwest, and to the mountains in the central and the deserts in the west. Indigenous folk of a pre-Columbus America dominated the countryside without even a thought of white settlers beckoning to explore their land in the centuries to come. These tribes weren't simply barbaric masses of savages and killers, but rather complex societies featuring thousands of languages and dialects, cultures with passionate obligations, political systems and leadership councils, and religions saturated with spiritualism and mythology. Unfortunately, however, A majority of these customs and beliefs were nearly wiped completely from the history books after the introduction of colonization in America in the 16th century, which saw the number of Native American populations decrease by hundreds of thousands. Only microscopic portions of these tribes make up American demographics in the present day. In order to preserve their histories, cultures, and ways of life, this is the first in a series of brief essays documenting the rich details of Native American tribes, ranging from the First Nations in Canada to the Nativos Mexicanos in Mexico. This is the first story of the Seven Council Fires, colloquially known as the Sioux. With roots in America dating back to 100 to 400 AD, the Sioux were and still are one of the largest nations of indigenous Americans in all of history. Members of the Sioux themselves call themselves the Great Sioux Nation, translated to Seven Council Fires in English. The fires represent the seven Oyate, translated to nations or peoples. Presently, these nations include the Teton or Lakota, a collective of 4 tribes called the Santee or Eastern Dakota, and the collective of 2 tribes called the Yangtun or Western Dakota. Most modern-day non-native scholars refer to these nations simply as the Lakota or Dakota, all dependent on the intricate dialect changes between specific tribes. These languages are called the Siouan Catawba and were spoken by various tribes ranging from the modern-day Carolinas up into Western Canada. One of the few dialect similarities throughout all tribes are the words Lakota and Dakota, which translates to ally when spoken by different members of different nations to one another. In the 1760s, French colonizers attributed the word Sioux to the Seven Council Fires, an abbreviation of the French word Nadasou, attributed to the native tribes by a colonist of the name Jean Nicolet in 1640. The word is a combination of the Ojibwe word for little snake, Nadawesi, and an incorrectly used suffix by French colonizers, u. Today, the people of Seven Council Fires are referred to in Ojibwe as Bwane, translated to roasters in English, most likely affiliated with the means of cooking used by the tribes of yesteryear. Other modern-day nations have legally changed their colonial names back to traditional names, whereas some have foregone the legal system in total and reject the usage of Romance language-derived names in general. In terms of traditional structures of society seen in various tribes, the Seven Council Fires feature a unique combination of family ties, natural connection, and both earthly and cosmic spiritualism. Many of the villages held what the English call camp circles, ceremonies promoting kinship and community, and members considered themselves a large extended family consisting of smaller immediate families. No 2 camp circles were alike either, and all ceremonies were guided by an appointed leader chosen by a council filled with elder statesmen from the tribe. The vitality of kinship was not limited to camp circles and family dynamics, however. Proper kinship was a requirement of all tribal members, extending from childhood to elderhood. This included being a proper relative, friend, and leader. It also included all living subjects on Earth, as well as all parts of the natural world. To put something before kinship, such as material riches or personal glory, would be to go against the strongest values each tribe maintained. These ideals carried over even into other eras of colonization. Members of the Seven Council Fires were not obstinate to trade with white settlers for no reason. Rather, they carried a deeply spiritual requirement to form a bond with all whom they traded with, including their invaders. Some early colonists fell in line with these indigenous customs and fostered such special bonds with tribal members, and they were adopted into the band as outsiders. Of course, these instances were few and far between, as most of the colonists were too stubborn or impatient to form social bonds with any Native American, regardless of tribe, and falsely attributed the customs to ego, pride, and narcissism. There was also a tightly woven system of religions within the Seven Council Fires, as well. The overarching belief was that the cosmos and everything in it was created by a being called the Great Spirit or the Great Mystery, when translated to English. The symbol of these beliefs came in the form of a sacred hoop, as English translations have it, also called medicine circles in other various indigenous dialects. The visual is meant to invoke the sense of oneness throughout the universe, all held together by the Great Spirit. This included the concept of all things, The trees and the hillsides, to the lakes and the riverbeds, to the birds and various creatures crawling across the planet, were all equal in spirit, but still below the status of the Great Mystery. Connecting tribal members to the spirits on the ground and in the sky was a type of prayer, and it translated to claiming a relationship with when spoken in English. In the Lakota nations, a prophet called White Buffalo Calf Woman was sent to Earth to act as a medium between the Great Spirit and the human race. Through this relationship, the prophet taught humans how to establish proper kinship and be a great member of the family through a series of ceremonies called the 7 Sacred Rites. These rites ranged from purification to a sun dance to vision quests to female puberty celebrations. All 7 rites were then confirmed via the smoking of a sacred pipe, in which all elements of the ritual represented the elements of Earth and the connections between them and humankind. Dreams are also incredibly important tools used by the 7 Council Fires to establish their connections with the spiritual world and enhance their abilities on an earthly realm. One such example was the instruction that dreaming of thunder beings, when translated to English, would turn the dreamer into a sacred jester, who would then share their supernatural power with all who encountered them and their comedic performances. Funeral practices were also hugely symbolic and spiritual rites performed by tribal members all throughout their history. Traditionally, tribes would honor the deceased with a 4-day wake in which all members of the band mourned and guided the dead spirit into the earthly resting place. Tribal members would also put the corpse of the deceased on a burial scaffold, either in the trees or on a vertical pole to keep the body off the ground. The body would remain there for a year, with offerings put on the head and cloth wrapped around the rest. The deceased were not strayed away from or kept private, however. Tribes would continue to speak to the bodies of the dead, even offering them food or drink. This was all part of the process of guiding the deceased along its spiritual journey and allowing the rest of the tribe to properly mourn, whilst also gaining newfound connections with the spiritual realm. Of course, no tribe of the 7 Council Fires was complete without an assortment of musical styles permeating around villages and campsites. Various tribes amongst the Dakota bands utilized a call-and-response style of song and dance, led by a solo vocalist who starts singing in a high pitch before transitioning to a specific phrase. The rest of the group then repeats this phrase, continuing to lower their pitch before stopping altogether with an effective pause. In the second half of the arrangement, performers will create sounds called honor beats. Honor beats usually consisted of 4 steady beats, symbolizing the low-frequency sounds of war, impending conflict, and later the sound of cannon fire after the colonization of America by Europeans brought over artillery-based warfare. The Dakota tribes also utilized percussion in their song and dance rituals. These bands especially practiced syncopation, which is the rhythmic beating of drums or other percussive surfaces to form an entire song. This could either be offbeat drumming, synchronized drumming, or most often a combination of the two. Some bands within the same tribe would engage in competitive musicianship, with songs that evolved from non-pattern ruffles to a patterned, fast-paced beat. In all Dakota-based tribal events, nothing could start until the Dakota flag song is played. This custom includes no dance, but is a pillar of powwows and celebrations of the warriors amongst each tribe. Across all musician customs of the 7 Council Fires, lyrical songs were few and far between, with most music only using syllabic sounds, vocables, and guttural noises without a translation. Sometimes, lyrics would be included, but only in the second half of performances. Women were also heavily utilized in song and dance rituals, normally singing at a higher pitch and carrying musical performances the second and third time through the song, or as many times as the piece is repeated. Every summer, these types of large communal performances were key pieces of the main assembly of all leaders across all 7 tribes, where tribal figures came together to restore their kinship values and deliberate on tribal ordeals. At the summer festivities, 4 main tribal leaders were appointed by the heads of each band in the tribes, depending on the nominee's intelligence, compassion, courage, and resiliency. This was the highest honor bestowed upon the 7 Council Fires, and one was only chosen if the rest of the leadership believed this member to be able to carry on all of the tribe's traditions and maintain their desired day-to-day lives. Responsibilities of the 4 leaders included making decisions on replotting camps and villages, navigating conflict between neighboring tribes, and planning large-scale tribal hunts. Below this sub-leadership were collections of fraternities of men, split into 2 factions of younger males and older males. Each faction had their own responsibilities, and the former leaders and various elders in the older age group helped guide their youthful counterparts. 7 council fires also included entire societies of warrior bands, who were tasked with leading hunts, training for battle, and providing security to the rest of the village or community. Alongside these warrior arms were 2 elected voices of the communities, called shirtwearers when translated to English. Shirtwearers were master communicators and peer mediators, tasked with settling disputes both within tribal bands and with foreign parties, such as the colonizers in the 16th century. Almost all shirtwearers were men, and had to display qualities of future leadership whilst also coming from a bloodline of former leaders as well. Ranked right below the shirtwearers were pipe holders. Pipe holders were vital to ceremonial rituals seen across tribes, as they guided peace talks within the ceremonies and made sure everyone involved had exactly what they needed. Pipe holders also helped the top leaders select potential campsites and village movement, as well as watching over the warrior bands whenever they would venture out on buffalo hunts. Men weren't the only ones with responsibilities, however. While there were defined gender roles across the 7 council fires, like many traditional Eastern cultures, women didn't do chores around the house. They did help make cloth and weave fabric, but they also were considered owners of the houses themselves, responsible for all decisions pertaining to a residence. Men and women also were not restricted to certain sexual preferences or intimate relationships either. Even gender itself was seen as a fluid identity, and tribal members assigned male at birth would sometimes take on the duties of those assigned female at birth, and vice versa, without judgment or scorn being passed on by elders or other members of a tribe. Overall, the 7 council fires saw themselves as a unique yet fundamental piece to the planet's ecosystem, whilst understanding the bond we form with each other and every other living thing on Earth is vital to a fulfilling and proper life. The ancestors of modern-day 7 council fires are first thought to have arrived in what is present-day northwestern Wisconsin and central Minnesota, back around 800 AD. They came from the central Mississippi River Valley, living there for at least a couple of millennia. These indigenous bands are now called the Woodland Blackduck Kathio-Clam River Continuum by English historians of modern age. The continuum didn't acquire the cultures and customs seen in northern tribal communities until 1300 AD, of which they acquired from fellow tribes in the region. It was around this time that the period of the continuum officially became the period of 7 council fires. Over the next 300 years, the 7 council fires developed into what we best consider the Sioux Native American branch, as they were met by European colonists in the 16th and 17th centuries. That is until the 1650s, when the area once inhabited by the 7 council fires around the source of the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes region in general was under a claims dispute by the Iroquois tribe of the First Nations. The Iroquois were longtime rivals to the 7 council fires, and the 2 tribes engaged in elongated warfare just as the fur traders from Europe arrived. Thus, by 1659, the Dakota tribes moved west into Wisconsin and Minnesota, and by 1700, nearly all tribal members called this region their home. Meanwhile, the Lakota tribes started pushing their villages westward into the Great Plains, and most of the 7 council fires ended up with them. With the westward expansion of indigenous folks, however, came along the westward expansion of colonists and pioneers currently colonizing America. These white settlers, of course, mingled with the 7 council fires in both the East and Northern Midwest territories, and introduced the horses to the tribes by the 18th century. Despite the acquisitions of horses and newfound approach to transportation, the Dakota tribes in present-day Wisconsin and Minnesota were unable to hold their eastward borders due to the constant encroachment of the Iroquois and other intertribal contestants. The 7 council fires also started dealing with massive outbreaks of smallpox and malaria due to the arrival of colonists, and saw their numbers deteriorate by over 30% by 1805, and the tribes still occupying the Great Lakes regions. Around the same time, the surviving Dakota tribes to the north and the Lakota tribes to the east began fur trading with the French. These practices date back into the 17th century, when the Iroquois first pushed the Seven Council Fires west. While the relationships the Lakota and Dakota built with the French were mostly docile, as long as the colonizers understood the vitality and importance of kinship, their history of trading wasn't without conflict. Seven Council Fires had more than a few conflicts with other tribes around the territories, and those rival tribes saw the French's involvement with the Sioux as encroachment on their peace. These tribes included the Ojibwe, the Cree, and the Meskwaki. After the turn of the 19th century, as the Seven Council Fires remnants pushed further into the Great Plains regions of America, they began to adopt customs and traits of the indigenous groups that had once called the Plains their homes for years. By 1803, the three major bands of the Western Dakota, Eastern Dakota, and Lakota were all incredibly distinct in their practices and customs, but still held their sacred bond of kinship, which kept the tribes connected well beyond their geographical developments. Unfortunately, it was around this time that the Seven Council Fires truly began to feel the disastrous effects colonization has on their lands and on their people. In 1825, they were forced into the Treaty of Prairie du Chien with 7 other indigenous tribes in an effort to stop intertribal warfare, all for the sake of the settlers. Then, 5 years later, they were forced into another treaty of the same name in 1830, in which the Lakota had to give up their lands found near the Des Moines River to the United States government. In 1849, with the birth of the Minnesota Territory, more Sioux lands were forcibly taken by the American leadership after they entered various contracts ensuring the tribes millions of US dollars after they had sold 21 million acres for $1.6 million. Yet in an unsurprising twist, nearly 80% of this money was kept by the American government, and more lands were stolen without proper notice. By 1858, the first ever Seven Council Fires Reservation was created in Charles Mix County of present-day South Dakota. The reservation consists of less than only 37,000 acres, but it was the event that led to various tribal leaders across all Seven Council Fires to speak out against the colonizers and affirm the desire to defend their homeland and fight back. The fighting truly began in 1862 with the Dakota War, stemming from the starved tribes whose nomadic hunting efforts were completely thwarted by white settlers. The colonizers wanted the tribes to hunt more like Europeans and settle down as farmers, but the Seven Council Fires saw this as a threat to their way of life and resisted. The conflict lasted all the way until December 26, 1862, when 38 members of the Dakota tribe were lynched in Mankato under the guise of the United States government, and the remaining tribal members were pushed out of Minnesota for good. The remaining Dakota bands split off to the reservations popping up throughout the North Dakota regions, South Dakota regions, Great Plains regions, or they moved west with the migrated Lakota branch. The Lakota had already entered a land agreement with the U.S. government in 1851 with the Fort Laramie Treaty. The contract was between 9 separate indigenous tribes who all agreed to stop intertribal conflict and allow for the safe passage of white settlers who were at that point engaging with the wagon trails and migrating to Oregon Territory. However, that treaty was swiftly broken just as quickly as it had been agreed to. The Lakota engaged in multiple scuffles with the Crow tribes, and with the uncontrolled influx of unruly settlers in the late 1850s as a result of Pikes Peak Gold Rush in Colorado, indigenous affairs quickly grew intolerable to their new neighbors. Another similar treaty to Fort Laramie was attempted a few years later in 1868, but again did little to mitigate the intertribal warfare as the Americans' systematic destruction of the American buffalo, which was the basic food and clothing source for most indigenous tribes in the western United States, ravaged the Seven Council Fires with famine, fatigue, and inflamed frustrations. When the Black Hills Gold Rush saw an influx of colonists settle along the northern Great Plains of modern-day South Dakota and Wyoming, the 1868 treaty was all but rendered dead. Once George Armstrong Custer brought an expansive expedition force into the area in 1874 and disrespected the indigenous bands already living in the area, the Seven Council Fires and neighboring northern Chippewa tribes had enough, and the Great Sioux War was underway in 2 short years in 1876. The Great Sioux War of 1876 was prefaced with various raids and smaller conflicts between the Seven Council Fires and both settlers and opposing tribes since the 1850s. Many of the battles were over the effects from the buffalo extinctions and land disputes, comprising the generalized Sioux Wars from 1850 to 1890. These conflicts ranged from the Dakota War of 1862 and Red Cloud's War to the Black Hills War and the Battle of the Little Bighorn from 1876 to 1877. The Great Sioux War of 1876 was specifically about the U.S. government's lackadaisical approach to keeping settlers out of the Black Hills, which had belonged to the two tribes claiming it for hundreds of years. The United States went to war led by the aforementioned Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, whereas the Chippewa, Arapaho, and Seven Council Fires were led by Crazy Horse, Chief Gall, and Sitting Bull. Throughout the conflict, the United States Army systematically sectioned off vital resources to the indigenous tribes in each swath of land they claimed. Eventually, the tribes were without choice but to make one final push. The final conflict of the 40-year series of wars is colloquially known as the Wounded Knee Massacre on December 29, 1890. The name is derived from the nearby Wounded Knee Creek on the Lakota Pine Ridge Native American Reservation, where almost 150 men, women, and children of a Lakota tribe were mercilessly slaughtered by the U.S. Army. Another 150 Lakota tribesmen escaped from the ordeal and fled into the countryside. However, it being the onset of winter, most of, if not all of the fleeing members died of hypothermia and other natural elements due to the incoming blizzard. The massacre at Wounded Knee was seen as a pivotal point in the Seven Council Fires' history. From this point forward, all tribes were subject to the assimilation of Native Americans into the colonized United States. The assimilation era was marked with various reservations and boarding schools being erected so that the tribal members would still have a stake to claim on their homeland. However, as is seen across all histories of all tribes to the First Nations and Indigenous Americans, these reservations were marked with inhumane conditions, and the boarding schools were simply vessels of cultural and spiritual deconstruction. Children were forced to adapt to Christian principles and European traditions, which eventually became American traditions, as the rest of the country was colonized and all tribal nations across the continent were subjected to partial, if any, sovereignty. These methods of assimilation lasted all the way into the 1980s, when efforts for self-determination swirled through the remaining community members considered members of the Seven Council Fires. In modern times, the Seven Council Fires have focused on reclaiming sovereignty in their lands. In 1980, they were awarded $100 million in reparations for the theft of the Black Hills region in the 1870s. However, the tribe has since refused as there is no monetary comparison for their ancestors' home. The deal is currently worth upwards of $1 billion in reparations, with zero expectation that they will ever be collected. There's also the present-day issue of the Dakota Access Oil Pipeline. In 2016, a group of Seven Council Fires members successfully protested the drilling of the Bakken pipeline of the Bakken oil fields, which are found on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. The pipeline would have introduced a bevy of environmental issues, such as toxifying drinking water and destroying the little cultural relationship the tribal members maintained with the earth. As of today, the pipeline is still under construction despite these protests and the written solidarity of 87 other tribal leaders who also reject the project's premise. All in all, the total population of the Seven Council Fires sits at just 170,000 as of the 2010 census, just a fraction of the numbers the tribe saw 200 plus years ago. Significant populations currently reside in both North and South Dakota, Minnesota, Nebraska, Montana, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Wyoming, as well as the Manitoba and Saskatchewan provinces in Canada. It's easy to think of the Sioux and only attribute them to the conflicts along the American frontier during the Wild West's heyday in the mid to late 19th century. But it's important to remember their histories and cultures date back centuries before. Instead, think of the Seven Council Fires as a network of close-knit communities bonded to each other and to the natural world around them through a dedicated focus on kinship. Think of them as environmentalists dedicating their lives to enhancing humankind's relationship with Earth. Think of them as expert buffalo hunters and agile warriors. Think of them as dreamers and spiritualists, as musicians and storytellers, with a deep-rooted love in friendship, family, and humanity. This is the story of the Seven Council Fires. The focus on legendary figures of the Wild West usually center on the villains of the era. Banditos, outlaws, criminals, desperados, all coming from various walks of life. It makes sense, too. The Old West is often regarded for its lawlessness, brash behavior, and uncontrolled violence plaguing smaller settlements and open territories.
Much of that legacy was left behind by the antagonists of the Western frontier. However, there's also a reason the West was eventually tamed for good. For as many outlaws and bandits that rode through the plains, deserts, and mountainsides of the frontier, there were countless deputies, sheriffs, and marshals waiting to catch them in their shadows. After all, the Old West is one of the biggest vacuums of folktales and storytelling in any period in American history or otherwise. And nothing completes a story like the good guys versus the bad guys, your point of view on who is who notwithstanding. To gather a better glimpse into the lives and legacies of some of the finest heroes against the seemingly undying waves of criminal activity, here is the first in a series of videos detailing brilliant United States lawmen and larger-than-life figures of the Wild West. Introducing the Legend of Bass Reeves. Bass Reeves, a future lawman and the first black U.S. Marshal west of the Mississippi River, was born in July of 1838 to enslaved parents in Crawford County, Arkansas. He was named after his grandfather, Bass Washington, and took on the surname of his owner, Arkansas State Legislator William Steele Reeves, as was the unfortunate yet common practice amongst enslaved peoples both before and during the 19th century. Bass Reeves spent much of his childhood as a water boy on his Crawford County farm, until he was old enough to work in the crops as a field hand. When he was only 8 years old, sometime in 1846, William Reeves uprooted his entire plantation and moved to Grayson County, Texas, where Bass Reeves and his family were still enslaved. In Grayson County, Bass Reeves befriended William's son and future Speaker of the Texas House of Representatives, George Reeves. George and Bass spent many a day together, with George sometimes offering protection and riding services to Bass during their downtime. When the two boys were of age, George was thrust right into the Civil War, fighting on the side of the Confederacy, as Texas had declared support for the rebellion. George dragged Bass along with him, despite Bass's lack of approval. Bass's service time included rumored participation in the Battle of Pea Ridge in March of 1862, the Battle of Chickamauga in September of 1863, and the Battle of the Missionary Ridge in November of 1863. All battles were served under the command of his old companion and current superior, Colonel George Reeves. However, it was also during the Civil War that Bass eventually escaped from his bondage, thought to occur prior to the latter two conflicts. While many accounts differ in the exact nature of Bass's departure, the most agreed upon story centers on a game of cards between Reeves and his former owner, George. Legend has it that during one of the quieter moments of George and Bass's tenure in the Confederate Army, the two men were playing cards when Bass ended one round with a victory, much to the chagrin of George. The two men then entered a physical altercation that saw Bass beat George to a pulp. Knowing he wasn't long for survival with the assault on a white soldier, Bass fled the South as he knew it and escaped to the Indian Territory located in predominantly present-day Oklahoma. A few accounts believe Bass left the Confederate Army as he had grown inspired by the whispers of freeing the slaves by the federal government. Nonetheless, Bass didn't take his chances, remaining enslaved, and sought sanctuary with various bands of Native Americans, most notably the Seminole, Cherokee, and Creek tribes located in the territory. With the tribes, Bass quickly learned their culture and ways of life. He was taught various languages and dialects at each camp he stayed in, gaining impressive education regarding indigenous customs, and more importantly, tracking skills used to hunt game and wanted outlaws. The Seminole, Cherokee, and Creek also taught Bass vital firearm skills. Bass was a natural gunman and became well known around the territorial campsites for his pistol accuracy. Legend has it he was also barred from shooting competitions held by the tribes, even though his rifle skills apparently sat somewhere around average. Of course, the turkey and other wild game used in the skills competitions would happily disagree. Bass's tenure in Indian Territory would only last a short time, however, when the Emancipation Proclamation and later the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution abolished all slavery and made Bass Reeves a freed man once and for all. Embracing his newfound title as a freedman, Bass left his tribal brothers and sisters for a new life near Van Buren, Arkansas. Here, Bass took up ranching and started a family after he married a Texas woman by the name of Nellie Jenny in 1864. Over the next few years, Bass and Nellie Reeves would see their family grow, eventually having 10 children together, 5 girls and 5 boys. Everyone helped out around the farm, and after a bit of time, Bass was able to focus his efforts in other areas around rural Arkansas. One such opportunity came from the Van Buren Federal Court, a local judiciary with partial jurisdiction over Indian Territory. The court was seeking out folks to act as guides for the U.S. deputy marshals going through Indian Territory and criminal roundups. With his insight into the surrounding lands and communication skills with various indigenous dialects, Bass was seen as a perfect fit and would accompany larger posses on occasion. Indian Territory was rife with outlaws and thieves finding refuge, due to the lack of major federal or state jurisdiction in the region. In 1875, Bass's infrequent quests into Indian Territory would become a full-time career after the Federal Western District Court relocated to Fort Smith, Arkansas, and Isaac C. Parker was appointed federal judge on May 10th. Immediately after his appointment, Parker chose James F. Fagan as the U.S. Marshal and followed up with a request for additional hires for around 200 open deputy U.S. Marshal positions. Bass Reeves was one of Fagan's first thoughts when finding a lawman who would suffice as deputy marshal. Fagan remembered Reeves' past relationships with a few tribes and ability to speak multiple languages. It was quite apparently a match made in heaven. After a short recruitment on the behalf of Parker and Fagan, Bass Reeves was made the first black marshal west of the Mississippi. He was assigned to the Western District, where he had been serving as a local scout, now in charge of his own crew of lawmen. Operating on dead or alive orders from Judge Parker, Reeves started manhunts across the 75,000 square miles he had been directed to cover. To collect his assignments, Reeves would first visit the United States Courthouse at Fort Smith, where he'd receive warrants for wanted criminals. Reeves was unable to read or write, but hired someone to read aloud all of the warrants down to their gritty details. Reeves would then memorize each warrant for all of its information, so when it came time to arrest, he could pick out the corresponding warrant without fail. Despite his illiteracy, his deft memory and intuition led to over 3,000 felony arrests and various rewards for his detective work. After Reeves would select his desired warrants, he'd make way into the untamed wilderness on his legendary white stallion, accompanied with a wagon, a cook, and usually a Native American posseman. These quests would traverse places like Fort Reno or the unassigned lands of Oklahoma Territory, reaching a round trip upwards of almost 1,000 miles. Sometimes, Reeves' bounty missions would see him team up with other famous lawmen, such as Bud Ledbetter and Bill Tillman. These pairings helped Reeves establish a respected status among U.S. Marshals, celebrated for his courage in the face of the grittiest of outlaws, and his unparalleled skills as an ambidextrous gunman, sporting 2 Colt pistols he could draw in the blink of an eye. When working by his lonesome, Reeves became well known as a master of disguise, being one of the first to utilize multiple aliases and various appearances, whether it be a tired cowboy, rugged gunslinger, or a seething outlaw. One of Reeves' most iconic disguises came on the Texas border while chasing down a pair of outlaws in the Red River Valley. After pursuing the bandits across the state of Texas, Reeves and his posse made up camp 30 miles away from the outlaws' hideout. They had taken shelter in the house of one of the outlaws' mothers, and Reeves knew just the trick to draw them out into the open. Directing his men to stand pat at the wayward campsite, Reeves set out to investigate the Red River Valley terrain, learning of its details and the stragglers who crossed the rural vista. He then rummaged through his clothes and found the dirtiest, most tattered garments, disguising himself as a tramp looking for refuge. Reeves then hid his handcuffs, guns, and U.S. Marshal badge in the pockets and seams of his clothing, so as not to draw the suspicion of the folks at home. After a 28-mile walk in old, beat-up shoes, Reeves made it to the old woman's house, making sure to show off his wooden cane and to tip his bullet hole-ridden cap when she greeted him. When the mother asked of Reeves' intentions, he told her that he had been chased by a posse of bounty hunters, explaining the holes in his hat were his trophies of a successful escape. He kindly asked for a warm meal, and he was always so courteous and respectful, even during undercover missions. The Outlaw's mother was moved by Reeves' performance and invited him in for supper. It was over the dinner table that she started spilling the beans of her son's own escapades as an outlaw. She went as far as to suggest Reeves might think about joining forces with them, an idea Reeves showed interest in from the get-go. The woman, comfortable enough to allow Reeves to stay into the evening, perked up when a loud whistle echoed from the valley behind the house, just as the sun was setting. She walked to the back door and let out a distinguished whistle herself, a sign that the coast was clear. Minutes later, the two outlaws walked inside and were quickly made familiar with Reeves. They didn't keep their guard up either, as the one outlaw's mother went on about Reeves' own troubles with the law. The pair of bandits agreed the best course of action was to come together as a trio and decided to set off in the morning for their next major sting. That night, Reeves slept in the same room as the outlaws, studying them carefully as to not draw attention to himself. When they both hit a deep sleep, he stood quietly and tiptoed over to their bunks, where he attached handcuffs to their wrists, never waking them from their slumber. The following morning, Reeves stood tall with his pistols at the ready, badge in one hand, and woke up the groggy outlaws. It was only seconds before they realized they were done for, and Reeves barked at them to stand and march outside, much to the dismay of the mother. The irate woman then followed Reeves in his catch for nearly 3 miles, berating him for abusing her trust and taking away her boy. In the end, it didn't matter, as Reeves eventually got the bandits back to the Red River campsite and would collect his $5,000 bounty from the courts in a few days' time. Around the same time, Reeves got a stake to claim in his takedown of the infamous bandit named Bob Dozier, who was known for committing just about every crime known possible within Indian territory. Dozier was also known for being fleet on foot and completely unpredictable. It's why no bounty hunter or lawman alike could bring him in before Bass Reeves picked up his warrant without a second thought. Reeves utilized his tracking skills he had learned during his time with the Native Americans, and followed him all the way into Cherokee Nation. Dozier knew Reeves was on his trail, and sent threatening letters and other messengers to attempt to thwart his pursuit, but Reeves persisted, unbothered by Dozier's games. On December 20th, 1878, Reeves ascended the Cherokee Hills with his trustiest possemen. They were in desperate need of dry ground, as a thunderous storm was approaching the woodland, but before a fire could be built, Reeves was nearly killed with a bullet that buzzed by his ear. Knowing danger was imminent, Reeves leapt for cover, spotting a shadow skimming through the nearby trees. He shot 2 rounds at the shadow before multiple shots rang out back towards the deputy marshal. Reeves, laying on the ground, peered around the trees to see Dozier bumbling towards him, caught in a fit of laughter, believing he had once again tricked another lawman into certain death. Of course, this was no ordinary lawman. Reeves stood up squarely and demanded Dozier surrender his gun, but Dozier heeded no compliance. In seconds, the outlaw raised his rifle from a crouched position, only for Reeves to beat him to the draw and fire a single, mortal round to the neck. Blood was spilt, but Reeves had remained victorious once again. Reeves' time as a deputy marshal wasn't all success stories, however. In 1887, he was charged with murdering his posse cook, allegedly due to a weapons malfunction while Reeves was cleaning his rifle. Reeves was forced to stand trial, but was fortunate enough to be represented by a close colleague in W.H.H. Clayton, and tried before his longtime friend, Judge Isaac Parker. Due to his pristine record and familiarity with the courts, Reeves was acquitted on all charges, and never brushed with the wrong side of the law again. Rather, the misstep fueled Reeves further into his career. The late 1880s and early 1890s saw plenty of additional accomplishments. These ranged from the disbandment of the Tom Story Gang after the titular leader's death in Paris, Texas in 1889, to the arrest of the notorious Seminole bandit, Greenleaf, after 18 years of avoiding capture in 1890. In 1896, Reeves' fortunes once again took a turn for the worse when his wife, Nellie, died of cancer at Fort Smith. 3 years prior, Reeves had been transferred to the Eastern District of Texas and would again be moved after his wife's death, this time to Muskogee Federal Court of Indian Territory in 1897. Reeves would marry once again in 1900, this time to Winnie Sumter of Oklahoma Territory. However, he found himself right back in the thick of a family matter a couple of years later in 1902. Reeves had just returned to Muskogee with 2 wanted criminals to the U.S. Marshal at the time, Leo Bennett. While finishing his reports with Bennett, the U.S. Marshal informed Reeves that his son, Benny Reeves, was charged and wanted for the murder of his wife, after the couple had a quarrel over Benny's increasing jealousy. Reeves was shocked at the news and did not take to it very well. None of the other deputy marshals had wanted the warrant despite it sitting on Bennett's desk for 48 hours prior. They all knew the risks of going after one of their own and left it up to Reeves to decide. After a few days of tireless debate with himself, Reeves felt it was his responsibility to hunt down his own son and ask him to pay for his crimes. A 2-week period passed by, and Reeves finally returned with his son, alive but in handcuffs. He was found guilty on murder charges and sentenced to life in prison, shipped off to serve his time at Fort Leavenworth Penitentiary in Kansas. In the end, Reeves' impassioned pleas to be the one to arrest his son paid dividends, as Benny Reeves was seen as an exemplary prisoner who never caused one iota of an issue 11 years into his sentence. After a citizen's petition, the boy-turned-man was fully pardoned and went on to live a normal, positive life after being given a second chance. A few years prior, Bass Reeves saw his own life change before his eyes. In 1907, after the admittance of Oklahoma to the Union as an official state, he was transitioned from deputy marshal to officer for the Muskogee Police Department. Even his short stint as a patrolman went swimmingly. Reeves beat went his entire 2-year tenure without a single reported crime, and he left the department with a clean track record and a respected president left behind. By 1909, Bass Reeves was barely a shell of his former self, having retired from the law and succumbed to his sickbed. Reeves was eventually diagnosed with Bright's disease, more officially known as nephritis. In short, Reeves' kidneys had inflamed past the point of healing, and it was only a matter of time before the illness took his life. Bass Reeves drew his final breath on January 12, 1910. After a small ceremony with friends and peers, he was buried in Muskogee, Oklahoma at the agency cemetery. As of today, the grave remains unmarked and is currently located on public property, making visitations to the Old West legend hard to come by. Nevertheless, Bass Reeves' story lives on through books, films, and oral traditions. In the years since his time guarding the Western Territories from scum and villainy, he has become an underrated figure in the Wild West's history. His accomplishments have gone as far as to suggest he is one of the main inspirations for the massive hit radio serial and television series The Lone Ranger, amongst other properties. While there is still plenty of debate around the exact impact Bass Reeves has left on the lore of America's frontier, without a doubt, his efforts cannot be denied. He was most famously quoted as saying, "Maybe the law ain't perfect, but it's the only one we got, and without it, we got nothing." And it's true. Without the dedication of folks like Bass Reeves, we'd still be left in the belligerent mess of violence that once plagued the Western Territories. Instead, we are left with one of the finest tales of heroism and justice in both Black history and American history. It's up to us to continue to share his exploits and make sure his goodwill does not go unseen. This is the legend of Bass Reeves.